I woke to darkness, as I often did these days. The single candle I had left burning through the night had dwindled to a mere stub, its weak flame casting long shadows across my cluttered chamber. My eyes adjusted slowly as I pushed aside the woolen blanket, the chill of the morning seeping through my night clothes. Another day in this city of death had begun. The scent of dried herbs hung thick in the air, rosemary, wormwood, and lavender bundles suspended from the low ceiling beams, their fragrance both comforting and medicinal. I had come to rely on these simple plants more than I cared to admit. Their properties might be modest against the ravages of the pestilence, but they offered something the city desperately needed: hope. I reached for the pewter cup beside my bed, swirling the dregs of last night's wine. It was sour on my tongue, but I welcomed its bite. These days, it helped to start with something that reminded me I could still feel. My chamber looked as it always did, a physician's life made manifest in objects. Leather-bound books stacked precariously on every surface, their pages dog-eared and marked with notes from more optimistic times. Glass vials of various sizes caught what little light filtered through the shuttered window, their contents ranging from murky tinctures to powders I had ground myself. A skull, my old professor's teaching aid, grinned at me from atop a pile of medical texts, as if amused by my futile efforts against the plague. "Not today," I muttered to the skull, a habit I had developed in my isolation. "Today we may find something that works." On my writing desk lay my journal, open to yesterday's entry. The ink had dried on words that recorded 27 dead in the merchant quarter alone. How many would today bring? I dipped my quill and added the date, September 17th, 1665, before closing the leather cover. Some records were better kept brief. As I reached for my shirt, a knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps that echoed through my small quarters. My heart quickened. A summons at this hour never brought good tidings. "A moment," I called, my voice still rough with sleep. I dressed hurriedly, fingers fumbling with the buttons of my shirt. The weight of what awaited beyond that door pressed upon me as surely as the low stone ceiling of my chamber. Each morning began this way now, with the knowledge that I walked among the dying, that I was their last hope in a city abandoned by God. My coat, once fine black wool now worn at the elbows, hung from a hook by the door. Beside it rested my mask, the long beaked visage that had become both my protection and my identity. I ran my fingers over its leather surface, feeling the stitching that held it together. The beak was stuffed with fresh herbs and spices: cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, and rose petals, my shield against the miasmatic air that carried the disease. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Dr. Mercer, please, we need you at once." I recognized the voice of young Thomas, the apothecary's apprentice. The urgency in his tone told me all I needed to know. Another household had fallen ill. I lit a fresh candle from the dying one, watching as the flame grew stronger, pushing back the shadows. How simple it would be to stay here, to bar the door and remain in the relative safety of my chambers. Each morning this thought came to me, and each morning I pushed it away. What sort of physician would I be if I abandoned those who needed me most? With practiced movements, I gathered my tools, the silver lancet for bloodletting, vials of herbal remedies, bandages and poultices. Into my leather satchel they went, along with a small notebook to record symptoms and treatments. Knowledge was our only hope of understanding this scourge, even if that understanding came too late for many. I tied the mask's ribbons behind my head, adjusting it until the eye holes aligned with my vision. The world narrowed to what I could see through these small openings, but perhaps that was a mercy. The full scope of suffering that waited outside was sometimes too much to bear. The gloves came next, thick leather reaching to my elbows, followed by my wide-brimmed hat. In my right hand I took up my physician's cane, a rod of polished yew topped with silver. It served both as a tool to examine patients without touching them, and as a means to keep the desperate at bay. Fully armored against the world, I stood before the door, taking one last deep breath of the herb-scented air of my sanctuary. My hand hesitated on the latch. How many more mornings would I have? How long before I too succumbed to the black death that ravaged our city? Every day could be my last, I whispered to myself. A prayer and acknowledgement rolled into one, but not today. I opened the door to find Thomas, his young face, pale with worry, shifting from foot to foot in the narrow hallway. "It's the magistrate's family, Dr. Mercer," he blurted out, 3 of them showing signs since dawn. I nodded, my expression hidden behind the beaked mask. "Lead the way." As we descended the creaking stairs of my lodging house, I could already hear the city awakening. But it was not the London I had known before. Gone were the cries of street vendors and the clatter of cartwheels. Instead, the occasional wail of mourning drifted through the air. And somewhere in the distance, the ominous toll of church bells counting the night's dead. The morning fog clung to the cobblestones as Thomas and I stepped outside. I paused at the threshold, surveying the street before me. The city had become unrecognizable, empty, save for shadowy figures peering from cracked shutters. From a nearby alley came the scrape of a shovel against stone. The grave diggers were already at their grim work. I tightened my grip on my physician's cane and stepped forward into the mist, moving toward the house of the magistrate. Another day had begun in this time of death, and I was once again the thin line between the living and the doomed. Morning came to the city in shades of gray. I stood at my door, reluctant to step into the mist that clung to the cobblestones like a shroud. My breath fogged against the inside of my mask as I adjusted the leather straps that held the beaked contraption to my face. The herbs packed within, dried lavender, rosemary, and wormwood, filled my nostrils with their pungent protection. At least, I prayed they would protect me. I pulled my wide-brimmed hat lower and tightened the collar of my waxed coat. My staff in one gloved hand, I stepped out into the street that once bustled with life. The sound of my boots against stone echoed eerily in the silence. This had been the merchant district, where just months ago vendors would call out their wares, and the air would be thick with the scent of fresh bread and roasting meats. Children would weave between the legs of shoppers, and musicians would play for coins tossed into upturned hats. Now, the only music was the distant tolling of the death bell. The morning fog twisted around my ankles as I walked, dampening the hem of my coat. It muffled what few sounds remained in this forsaken place: the creak of a shutter, the scurry of a rat across my path. I tapped my staff rhythmically against the cobblestones, partly to announce my presence, partly to keep time with my own beating heart. The regular sound was comforting in a world that had lost all sense of rhythm. A cart lay overturned in the middle of the street, its contents, once precious silks from the east, now sodden rags stained with mud. The horse that had pulled it was long gone, either dead or stolen by those desperate enough to risk the contamination. I skirted around it, noting the red cross hastily painted on a door nearby. Another household claimed by death. From somewhere above, eyes watched. I could feel them on me as I passed beneath balconies and windows. Most shutters were closed tight, but occasionally I caught glimpses of pale faces peering through cracks, vanishing like ghosts when I turned my head. The living were becoming as spectral as the dead. "Doctor," a voice whispered from a shadowed doorway. I paused, turning slowly. An old woman stood half hidden in darkness, her face a web of wrinkles, her eyes sunken but alert. "They took him in the night. My son said he had the marks." I approached cautiously, maintaining the distance that had become second nature. "Was he ill, madam?" She shook her head vehemently. "A rash from the tannery, nothing more." But they wouldn't listen. Her gnarled fingers clutched at a small cloth bundle. "His medicine. He needs it for his lungs." She held it out to me, her hand trembling. I hesitated. The city officials had become zealous in their quest to contain the pestilence, often seizing those with even the slightest symptoms. Sometimes these people were taken to the pest houses. Sometimes they simply disappeared. I took the bundle from her, careful not to touch her skin. "I will try to find him," I said, knowing full well that promises held little weight in these times. But the relief in her eyes was payment enough. As I continued down the street, the bundle tucked safely into my pocket, a sound caught my attention, a soft, rhythmic sobbing. I slowed my pace, listening. It came from a narrow house wedged between two larger buildings, its door marked with a fading yellow cloth, the sign of quarantine. The sobbing paused, then resumed, higher pitched now. A child. My hand hovered over the door. To enter was to risk contamination, but to leave a child alone among the dead. Before I could decide, the sobbing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I marked the house in my mind, resolving to return with the constable. Though what good that would do, I couldn't say. The city's resources were stretched beyond breaking. I pressed on through the fog that seemed to thicken with each passing minute. The buildings loomed on either side, their upper stories nearly touching above me, blotting out what little morning light filtered through the clouds. In the gloom, I nearly collided with a figure that emerged suddenly from an alleyway. "Your pardon," I murmured, stepping aside. The man, for it was a man, though gaunt and hollow-eyed, stared at my mask with a mixture of fear and hope. "Are you come to help us then?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "They say there's a cure. In the cathedral, the priests are blessing water." "There is no cure yet," I said firmly. False hope was as dangerous as despair in these times. "Keep to your home. Burn rosemary if you have it. Drink clean water." He laughed bitterly. "Clean water? The wells are fouled, the rivers choked with the dead." He leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "There are some who say this is no natural plague, that it's the work of poisoners, Jews, foreigners, witches. Take your pick." I'd heard these rumors before. Fear always sought someone to blame. "The disease cares not for faith or birthplace," I replied. "It takes all equally." "So they say," he muttered, then shuffled past me into the fog. As I approached the central square, the silence gave way to low murmurs and the occasional bark of orders. City guardsmen stood at intervals, their halberds gleaming dully in the gray light. A cart piled high with shrouded forms waited near the fountain that had once been the pride of the district. Two men in rough clothes loaded another body onto the pile. I kept my distance, observing. This daily collection had become routine, yet the sight still twisted something deep within me. Each bundle had been someone's child, someone's beloved, someone's entire world. A guardsman noticed me and raised his hand in a half salute, half warning. "Keep moving, doctor." Squares closed after the collection. I nodded and turned down a side street, intending to circle around toward the noble district where my next patient awaited. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing more of the city's transformation. Doors stood ajar, their occupants fled or dead. Weeds pushed between cobblestones where no foot had tread in weeks. A cat, thin but alive, watched me from a windowsill, perhaps the only creature in this part of the city that seemed untouched by our human tragedy. As I neared the boundary between districts, marked by an ornate archway, the sound of approaching hooves made me press myself against a wall. A rider appeared, cloaked and hooded, moving at speed despite the dangerous conditions. As they passed beneath the arch, their hood fell back momentarily, revealing the crimson robes of an official beneath. Something about their urgency sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. I waited until the sound of hooves faded before continuing. The noble district lay ahead, where grand houses stood behind high walls. There, at least, some semblance of life continued, though whether that was wisdom or folly remained to be seen. The plague cared nothing for wealth or title, and confined spaces often hastened its spread. My thoughts returned to the child I'd heard crying. Perhaps after attending to the nobleman, I could return with some bread and clean water. It wasn't much, but in these times, Small mercies were all any of us could offer. With this resolution, I straightened my shoulders and continued on my path, the weight of my medicine bag heavy against my hip, the morning sun finally breaking through the fog to cast long shadows before me. The day stretched ahead, full of suffering and small hopes, not unlike the days that had come before and those that would surely follow. I approached the grand mansion with measured steps, my leather boots clicking against the cobblestones of the private courtyard. Unlike the common dwellings I had visited earlier, the Blackwood estate stood apart from the crowded streets, a testament to wealth that even plague could not immediately diminish. The morning fog had thinned, but still clung to the ornate iron gates like desperate spirits. Dr. Mercer, a servant, called from the doorway, his voice barely above a whisper. "The mistress awaits you upstairs. Please hurry." The servant, Thomas, I recalled from previous visits, looked gaunt, his livery hanging loose on his frame. I nodded silently, adjusting my leather mask with its glass-eyed beak. The servants feared the mask nearly as much as the disease it was meant to protect against, but I had grown accustomed to the weight of it, to breathing through the dried herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges that filled the beak. "Has Lord Blackwood's condition changed since yesterday?" I asked, following Thomas into the marble foyer. Thomas shook his head. "He has not spoken since nightfall. The mistress hasn't left his side." The grand entrance hall, once bustling with servants and visitors, stood eerily silent. Candelabras that would normally hold dozens of beeswax candles remained unlit, save for a single flame guiding our path. Even wealth could not purchase more wax during these times, not when the candle makers themselves were dying. I followed Thomas up the curved staircase, my hand gliding along the polished oak banister. The wood felt cool beneath my gloved fingers. How many hands had touched this same surface? How many now lay cold in the earth? I had stopped counting my patients months ago. The numbers became meaningless when every street held more dying than living. "The children?" I inquired softly. "Sent to the country estate last week," Thomas replied. Lady Blackwood insisted, despite his lordship's protests, that the family should remain together. I nodded. A wise decision. The country air might spare them, though nowhere seemed truly safe anymore. The corridor leading to Lord Blackwood's chambers was lined with portraits, severe-looking men and demure women spanning generations of wealth and power. Their painted eyes seemed to follow me accusingly. "What good was your medicine now, physician? What use your herbs and tinctures against God's judgment?" I could smell the sickness before Thomas opened the bedchamber door, that distinct sweet-sour odor that had become as familiar to me as my own scent. No amount of burning sage or sprinkled lavender could mask it entirely. Lady Blackwood rose from her chair as I entered, her elegant features drawn with exhaustion. Once the most sought-after beauty in 3 counties, she now looked like a ghost herself, pale, hollowed, her golden hair hastily pinned beneath a simple cap. "Dr. Mercer," she whispered, reaching for my sleeve with trembling fingers. "He's grown worse." The fever returned in the night. I set my leather doctor's bag on a nearby table and approached the massive 4-poster bed. Heavy velvet curtains had been partially drawn back, allowing dim light to fall across Lord Blackwood's face. He had been a robust man of 40 when I first became the family physician 5 years ago. Now he looked twice that age, his skin yellowed and drawn tight across his cheekbones. "Has he taken any water, any broth?" I asked, removing my gloves to feel his pulse. "A few sips at dawn," Lady Blackwood replied. He seemed to recognize me then. Lord Blackwood's pulse fluttered weakly beneath my fingers, a bird's wing beating against a closing fist. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one seeming to require tremendous effort. I noted the dark swellings at his neck, now larger than yesterday, the skin around them an angry purple-black. I had seen this progression too many times before. "Margaret," he suddenly rasped, his eyes opening but not focusing. "Margaret, is that you?" Lady Blackwood rushed to his side, taking his hand. "I'm here, William. The children, keep them away." "They're safe in the country, my love," she soothed, stroking his fevered brow. "With your sister." I turned away, busying myself with my bag of remedies, not out of any real hope they would help, but to give the couple a moment of privacy. Around the grand chamber, candles guttered in their silver holders, casting long shadows across the ornate tapestries and carved furniture. A fire burned low in the massive stone fireplace, but did little to chase away the chill that seemed to permeate the room. From my bag, I withdrew a small glass vial of tincture, valerian root and poppy, mixed with honey to ease the bitterness. It would not cure him, but it might ease his pain, help him sleep more peacefully. "My lady," I said gently, "I must speak honestly." Lady Blackwood's shoulders stiffened, but she nodded. "I have never asked you to do otherwise, doctor. The infection has spread, the buboes are larger, and his blood is corrupted. I can offer something for the pain, but there is no cure," she finished, her voice flat. "I know this. I have always known this, since the first cases appeared in the harbor district." I mixed the tincture with water in a silver cup and approached the bed again. "Help me raise his head. He should drink this." Together we lifted Lord Blackwood enough to press the cup to his cracked lips. He swallowed reflexively, most of the liquid disappearing down his throat. A good sign, at least. He could still swallow. "Will it be much longer?" Lady Blackwood asked, not meeting my eyes. I hesitated. "It's difficult to say with certainty. Perhaps a day, perhaps less." She nodded, composure momentarily faltering as tears welled in her eyes. Should I send for Father Morris? If it would comfort you both, yes." I replaced my instruments in my bag. "I'll return this evening." "And what of me, doctor?" she asked suddenly. "I have tended him day and night. Surely I must be infected as well." I studied her carefully. "No signs of fever yet, no swellings at neck or armpit. Some seem immune to the contagion, my lady. Continue with the preventatives I prescribed, the vinegar washes, the burning of rosemary, and pray." As I prepared to leave, Lord Blackwood suddenly gripped my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes, momentarily clear, fixed on mine. "The city," he whispered urgently. "Something walks in the streets at night, something worse than plague." Lady Blackwood made a distressed sound. "The fever speaks through him, doctor. Pay it no mind." But Lord Blackwood's gaze remained lucid, boring into mine. "The bell tower. Go there at midnight. See for yourself." His grip slackened as the tincture began to take effect, his eyelids growing heavy. I gently placed his hand back on the coverlet, troubled by his words despite myself. Many of the dying spoke of visions, of strange sights and sounds. The line between fevered delusion and genuine insight, often blurred at the threshold of death. I bowed slightly to Lady Blackwood. "I'll return after sunset. Send Thomas if his condition changes suddenly." She walked me to the door, pausing at the threshold. "Dr. Mercer," she said quietly, "you've been kind to our family. Whatever happens, I shan't forget it." I nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. How many times had I failed to save those in my care? What good was kindness without cure? As I descended the grand staircase, Thomas waiting to escort me out, I found my thoughts returning to Lord Blackwood's strange warning. The bell tower at midnight, something worse than plague walking the streets. Nonsense, surely, the ramblings of a dying mind. And yet, as I stepped back into the subdued daylight, adjusting my mask before heading toward my next patient, I could not shake the feeling that there was more to his words than mere delirium. The city had changed in ways beyond the obvious devastation of disease. Strange figures glimpsed in the fog, whispers of secret gatherings, the missing apothecary. Perhaps tonight, I would find myself near the bell tower as midnight approached. Not out of belief in a dying man's ravings, I told myself, but simply because knowledge was a physician's greatest tool, and in these dark days, I needed every tool I could grasp. As I made my way through the cramped streets of the city's merchant quarter, the afternoon sun struggled to penetrate the thick fog that had settled over the rooftops. The usual clamor of commerce had faded to an eerie silence. Where once vendors would call out their wares and hagglers would debate prices with theatrical fervor, now only the occasional creak of a shudder or distant cough punctuated the stillness. I had been summoned to the home of Vincenzo Moretti, a wealthy silk merchant whose trading house had once been the envy of the city. 3 days prior, his steward had appeared at my door, eyes hollow with worry, bearing a note sealed with the Moretti family crest. The message was brief. "Come quickly, master ill, will pay handsomely." Now I stood before the merchant's establishment, a grand 3-story building with ornate stonework that spoke of better days. The windows were shuttered, and a red cloth hung limply from the door handle, the universal signal that sickness dwelled within. I adjusted my mask, ensuring the herbs packed within the long beak would filter the miasma that carried the pestilence. The leather of my gloves creaked as I tightened them. "God grant me strength," I murmured, a prayer that had become as much a part of my daily ritual as the donning of my protective garments. I knocked 3 times upon the heavy oak door. The sound echoed through the empty street. After a long moment, it swung open to reveal Antonio Moretti's faithful steward. His face was gaunt, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, or perhaps from tears already shed. "Doctor," he whispered, bowing slightly, "thank the Lord you've come. The master, he worsens by the hour." I stepped inside, and the familiar scent of wealth, beeswax, exotic woods, and the faintest trace of imported perfumes mingled with something else, something sour and unmistakable to one who had witnessed this plague claim hundreds. It was the smell of impending death. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice muffled behind my mask. "This way, sir," Antonio replied, leading me not toward the grand staircase that would take us to the family's private quarters, but toward the back of the house. "He insisted on remaining in his storeroom, says he wishes to die among his treasures, if die he must." We passed through a narrow corridor, the walls lined with paintings of serene landscapes and noble ancestors who stared down at me with judgmental eyes. Had they been able to speak, would they curse me for my failures? So many had died despite my efforts. What right had I to call myself a doctor when my medicine seemed as effective as a prayer cast into an indifferent sky? Antonio paused before a heavy door reinforced with iron bands. "He's alone, sir. The family, we've sent them to the country estate," Master Moretti insisted, a wise precaution. I nodded approval. "How long has he shown symptoms?" 4 days, sir. First the fever, then the swellings." Antonio's voice cracked. "He refused to let me stay with him past yesterday, made me promise to keep my distance." Another wise decision, though likely too late if Antonio had been tending to him directly. I would need to examine the steward before departing, but first, the merchant awaited. I pushed open the door to reveal a vast storeroom, dimly lit by a few sputtering candles. Shelves climbed to the ceiling, laden with bolts of silk in colors that seemed to absorb the feeble light rather than reflect it. Spices from distant lands filled wooden crates, their exotic aromas barely perceptible beneath the heavier scent of sickness. And there, in the center of his diminished empire, lay Vincenzo Moretti upon a makeshift bed of velvet cushions and fine linens. A man who had once commanded respect with his booming voice and confident stride was now reduced to a trembling figure whose breath came in labored gasps. "The masked angel of death comes at last," Moretti wheezed, attempting a smile that transformed into a grimace of pain. I approached slowly, setting my leather physician's bag beside him. "I am no angel, Master Moretti, merely a doctor trying to help where I can. We both know what visits this city is beyond your medicines," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. But I had to try, had to see if gold might persuade death to pass me by. I knelt beside him, beginning my examination with practiced movements. His skin burned with fever, and beneath his nightshirt, the telltale swellings distorted his neck and armpits, buboes filled with corruption. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites turned yellow. The disease had progressed far too far. Water, he rasped. I poured from a nearby pitcher into a silver cup and supported his head as he drank, most of the liquid spilling down his chin. Once a proud man, now reduced to being cared for like an infant. The plague held no regard for station or wealth. "Tell me true, doctor," Moretti said after catching his breath. "How long?" The question all patients asked eventually. I had learned not to offer false hope, yet neither did I wish to strip away the last comfort of possibility. "The night will be difficult," I said carefully. "If you survive until morning, perhaps there is chance." Moretti's laugh was a dry, rattling sound. Always the diplomat. His hand fumbled at his side, eventually grasping a small velvet pouch. With trembling fingers he pressed it into my palm. "For your honesty and your time." The pouch felt heavy. Gold coins, certainly more than my usual fee.
I should refuse it.
What use was wealth to a man who walked daily among the dying? Yet I knew that my supplies needed replenishing, and the herbalist would not accept payment in gratitude. "I will prepare something for the pain," I said, opening my bag and selecting various vials and packets. I mixed a tincture of poppy with wine, adding herbs that might ease his breathing, if not cure what ailed him. As I worked, Moretti's eyes never left my hands. "I was a man of influence," he murmured. "Had the ear of the mayor, dined with bishops. Now my gold cannot buy me a single extra day. None of us knows when death will claim us," I replied, helping him drink the medicine. "This plague merely makes the uncertainty more evident." Moretti closed his eyes as the pain-relieving draft began to take effect. "My wife, my children," he whispered. "Will they remember me kindly, doctor, or will they recall only my absences, my pursuit of wealth?" In that moment, I was no longer merely a physician but a confessor of sorts, perhaps the last person to hear this man's doubts and regrets. So many deathbeds had become altars of confession, as if unburdening the soul might somehow lighten the body's suffering. "They will remember your provision, your protection," I assured him, "and how you sent them away to safety. Thinking of them even now." A single tear tracked down his fevered cheek. "I should have spent less time with these silks and more time with them." I had no answer for this. How many similar regrets had I heard in recent months? The plague did not just reveal the contents of one's body through its terrible symptoms. It also laid bare the contents of one's heart. As night began to fall, Moretti's breathing grew more labored. I remained beside him, occasionally wiping his brow with a damp cloth or helping him take small sips of water. Outside, the bell tolled the evening hour, its solemn notes counting down time that Moretti likely had precious little of. "Doctor," he whispered suddenly, his eyes flying open with surprising clarity. In the corner cabinet, a red ledger. "Burn it, please." I glanced toward the ornate cabinet he indicated. "Your business records." "My sins," he replied, "debts collected too harshly, competitors ruined." "Burn it. Let God judge me without that evidence." Another confession, another burden placed upon my shoulders. I nodded, though I knew not whether I would honor such a request. Was it my place to destroy what might be important to his family or his business partners? As midnight approached, Moretti fell into a fitful sleep, his breathing shallow and irregular. I knew I should move on. Other patients awaited my attention, but something held me there in that dimly lit storeroom. Among the silks and spices that had once been a man's measure of success, I would need to visit the apothecary tomorrow for more supplies. The herbs in my mask were losing their potency, and my stores of remedies were running low. As I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave Moretti to whatever fate awaited him, I wondered about the apothecary himself. He had seemed distracted during my last visit, almost fearful. Perhaps tomorrow would bring answers, or simply more questions in this city of mounting deaths and diminishing hope. I trudged up the narrow street toward Master Finch's apothecary, my boots splashing through shallow puddles from the morning's rain. The weight of my day already hung heavy upon my shoulders. Each house I had visited, adding another stone to the burden I carried. My leather mask, with its protruding beak filled with protective herbs, had begun to chafe against my skin. but I dared not remove it, even for a moment of relief. Master Finch was one of the few allies I had left in this forsaken city. While others cowered from my approach, he would greet me with a nod, and sometimes even a smile, though it was often strained with worry. His knowledge of herbs and tinctures exceeded my own, and I had come to rely on his wisdom. I needed more dried rosemary and sage for my mask, and perhaps some of his special vinegar solution. My supplies were dwindling faster than ever, as the plague tightened its grip on the city. As I approached his shop, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The door, usually locked tight against thieves and the curious, stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. "Master Finch," I called out, my voice muffled behind my mask. No answer came from within the darkened shop. I pushed the door open with my cane, the hinges creaking softly as it swung inward. The familiar bell above the door gave a half-hearted jingle, the sound eerily hollow in the silent space. The scent hit me first, sulfur, sharp and acrid, mingling with the usual perfume of dried herbs and tinctures. It was the smell of alchemy gone wrong, of mixtures that should never have been combined. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting slowly to the dim interior. I called again, though I suspected now that I would receive no reply. The shop lay in disarray, so unlike the meticulously organized space I had come to know. Glass crunched beneath my boots as I moved further inside. Looking down, I saw the shattered remains of a vial, its contents having left a dark stain across the floorboards. I crouched down, careful not to touch the mysterious liquid, and noticed tiny bubbles still forming at its edges. Whatever had been inside that vial had broken recently. The shelves that normally held neat rows of labeled jars now stood half empty, their contents either taken or knocked to the floor in haste. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, swaying slightly as if someone had recently disturbed them. The large wooden countertop where Master Finch would carefully measure powders onto his brass scales was cleared of its usual implements, save for a single mortar and pestle, the stone basin still containing some crushed green substance. I dipped my gloved finger into the mortar and brought it closer to examine. Wormwood, if I was not mistaken, often used for fevers and to drive away parasites. But why had it been left mid-preparation? A shuffling sound from the back room drew my attention. Perhaps Master Finch was there after all. Moving cautiously, I made my way past the counter toward the curtained doorway that led to his private workroom. "It is Dr. Thorne," I announced, not wishing to startle him if he was indeed there. "Are you well, Master Finch?" Again, silence was my only answer. I pushed the curtain aside with my cane and peered into the room beyond. A single candle burned low in its holder, casting long shadows across walls lined with books and strange diagrams. Master Finch's workbench was covered with open texts, scraps of parchment bearing hurried notes, and several more vials of mysterious substances. The small window at the back of the room stood open, the shutters banging gently against the wall with each gust of wind. Had he fled through there, or had someone entered that way? I approached the workbench, my eyes scanning the scattered notes. Most were written in Master Finch's careful hand, detailing measurements and ingredients for various remedies. But one page caught my attention, a letter, half concealed beneath a leather-bound journal. I slid it free and held it closer to the candle's flame. "My dear friend," it began in an unfamiliar script, "I have confirmed your suspicions. The marked houses are not chosen by chance. Meet me tonight at the old bell tower. Bring your records. Trust no one wearing red." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the draft from the open window. I folded the letter and slipped it into the inner pocket of my coat. Whatever this meant, it seemed Master Finch had uncovered something dangerous, something perhaps connected to the plague itself. As I turned to leave, my foot struck something solid beneath the workbench. Crouching down, I discovered a small wooden chest, its lock broken. Inside were several small cloth pouches and a leather-bound journal much older than the one on the table. I took the journal and one of the pouches, which clinked with the sound of glass vials within. The floor creaked beyond the curtained doorway. Someone else was in the shop now. I extinguished the candle with a quick pinch of my fingers and pressed myself against the wall beside the window. The curtain rustled and a beam of light from a lantern swept across the room. "Someone's been here recently," a man's voice muttered. "The candle's still warm. Check the cellar," another voice commanded. "He might be hiding there." I hesitated only a moment before making my decision. With as much stealth as my bulky plague doctor's attire would allow, I climbed through the window and dropped into the narrow alley behind the shop. The voices continued inside, growing more urgent as they discovered the open window. I hurried down the alley, keeping to the shadows as best I could. The contents of the pouch clinked softly against my side with each step, and the weight of the journal and letter seemed to grow heavier by the moment. Whatever Master Finch had discovered had put him in danger, and now it seemed I was entangled in it as well. The bells of St. Martin's Church tolled the hour as I emerged onto a wider street. 4 o'clock. I needed a safe place to examine what I had taken from the apothecary's shop, somewhere the mysterious men in the shop would not think to look for me. My mind turned to the old watchman's tower on the eastern wall. It was largely abandoned now, as the city guard had consolidated their forces to the main gates. The watchman, an elderly man named Giles, was one of the few who did not shrink from my presence. Perhaps he would offer me sanctuary for a few hours. As I made my way through the winding streets toward the eastern wall, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The letter's warning echoed in my mind. "Trust no one wearing red." I found myself eyeing every passerby with suspicion, noting the colors of their garments with newfound attention. What had Master Finch uncovered? And more importantly, where was he now? The vanishing of the apothecary was but one more mystery in a city already shrouded in death and fear. As night began to fall, I knew that the answers I sought might lead me into even greater danger. But I was a physician, a seeker of truth amidst suffering. I could not turn away now. The eastern wall loomed ahead, and with it I hoped a moment of respite to gather my thoughts and examine my newfound possessions. Whatever came next, I knew that the plague doctor's path had taken an unexpected turn into shadows far deeper than those cast by disease alone. I approached the towering stone facade of St. Catherine's Cathedral with measured steps, my leather boots echoing against the cobblestones. The morning fog had lifted, but a persistent gloom remained, as if the sky itself mourned with the city. The great wooden doors loomed before me, worn smooth by centuries of faithful hands. I paused, adjusting my mask, a beaked contraption filled with dried rosemary, mint, and rose petals, designed to ward off the miasma that carried the plague. I hadn't come seeking God, necessarily. Faith and science warred within me daily, and today, exhaustion had tipped the scales toward the need for silence rather than salvation. The heavy door groaned as I pulled it open just enough to slip inside. "Dr. Blackwood," a voice called softly from the shadows. It was Father Matthias, his thin frame silhouetted against the dancing light of 100 candles. "I had a feeling you might come today." The air inside felt different from the death-tainted streets, heavy with incense and beeswax, tinged with a musty scent of ancient stone. My footsteps echoed through the vast, empty nave as I approached the priest, the sound bouncing between towering pillars that reached toward heaven like petrified trees. "The Rossi family," I said simply. "I couldn't save them, not even the youngest." Father Matthias nodded, his eyes reflecting the candlelight with a sadness that seemed to reach beyond the present tragedy. "You carry too much, Doctor. Their souls are with God now." I removed my hat, but kept my mask in place, a habit born of paranoia and practicality. My hand traced along a weathered pew, feeling the indentations left by generations of worshippers. Sometimes, I wonder if that's enough. The cathedral was nearly empty this morning. An old woman knelt in prayer near the front, her whispered pleas occasionally reaching my ears. In the side chapel, a young acolyte polished silver candlesticks with slow, methodical movements. The soft scrape of metal against cloth created a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. "Walk with me," Father Matthias said, gesturing toward the transept where stained glass filtered the meager sunlight into pools of blue and crimson on the stone floor. We moved slowly, my medical bag heavy against my side, the priest's robes whispering against the flagstones. "You look for answers in your medicines," he began, his voice deliberately low, "in your herbs and tinctures. But some in my congregation whisper of other answers." I glanced sideways at him. "Superstition grows like weeds in times like these. The plague follows natural laws, Father. It needs no supernatural explanation. Does it not?" He stopped before the great rose window, its colored glass depicting scenes of judgment and mercy. "3 nights ago, a man came to confession. He spoke of strange gatherings in the abandoned wells beneath the old quarter. Men in masks unlike yours, Doctor. Men who speak of the plague as their servant, not their enemy." A chill ran down my spine, despite myself, the ravings of a frightened mind. Perhaps, the priest fingered his wooden crucifix thoughtfully, or perhaps there are forces that neither your science nor my faith fully comprehends. Above us, a pigeon fluttered among the rafters, its wings creating a soft, persistent rhythm. Dust motes danced in the colored light, swirling like tiny galaxies as we disturbed the air with our passage. I removed my gloves slowly, allowing myself to feel the cool stone of a nearby pillar beneath my fingertips. The sensation anchored me to reality, to science and reason, even as the priest's words tugged at older, deeper fears. "What exactly are you suggesting, Father?" I asked, watching a single candle flame waver and straighten. He guided me toward the altar, where an ancient book lay open. Its pages were yellow with age, the ink faded to a rusty brown. This chronicle dates from the last great plague, nearly 300 years past. The bishop who wrote it spoke of similar whispers, of men who understood the sickness too well, who appeared in villages just before the deaths began. My fingers hovered over the fragile parchment, not quite touching. The Latin words seemed to swim before my tired eyes. Coincidence? The plague travels along trade routes, so do men. Indeed, Father Matthias closed the book gently, but the chronicle also speaks of recoveries, of remedies found not in herbs or bloodletting, but in hidden knowledge. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the occasional creak of ancient timbers and the distant murmur of prayer. I became aware of my own breathing inside the mask, slightly labored, warm against my face. "There is a man," the priest continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, "a scholar who studies these things, Brother Thomas, at the monastery of Saint Sebastian. He collects unusual accounts." From the front of the church came the clatter of a fallen hymnal, making us both start. The old woman crossed herself and rose stiffly, shuffling toward the confessional. "You think this Brother Thomas might have insight into the plague?" I asked, skepticism warring with the desperate hope that clings to any physician in times of endless death. "I think," Father Matthias said carefully, "that in times when God seems silent, we must listen more carefully to all voices." We had circled back to the transept now. Through the stained glass, I could see the outline of the bell tower, where the hourly toll would soon sound, marking another interval in this seemingly endless nightmare. "There is more," the priest said, his hand on my arm now. Strange markings have appeared on the doors of houses, some before the plague touches them, some after. And a man in red has been seen watching those houses. A man in red. The word stirred something in my memory. A page from the apothecary's journal I'd found just yesterday. Yes, a doctor, some say, though not one known to the guild. He wears a mask like yours, but his robes are crimson, not black, and he comes at night, watching but never helping. The cathedral bells began to toll the hour, each resonant peal vibrating through stone and bone alike. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the sound wash over me like waves. I should go, I said, reaching for my medical bag. There are patients waiting. Father Matthias nodded, but his expression remained troubled. Visit Brother Thomas if you can, doctor. The monastery lies just beyond the east gate, and he hesitated, then added, be wary after dark. Not all predators in this city carry the plague. I left the cathedral with the echoes of the bells still ringing in my ears, the priest's words weighing on my mind more heavily than I cared to admit. Outside, the afternoon had grown darker, clouds gathering like mourners above the city. My next visit would take me to the eastern quarter, close enough to the monastery that I might make the detour. Science told me the priest's warnings were nothing but fearful fancy, and yet, as a physician, I had sworn to consider all possible remedies. As I adjusted my hat against the first spatters of rain, a flash of red caught my eye from an alleyway across the square. I turned quickly, but saw only shadows and the retreating figure of a street urchin darting for shelter. Just coincidence, I told myself, stepping into the growing storm, nothing more. But for the first time in years, I found myself offering a silent prayer as I walked away from the house of God and back into the dying city. As dusk settled over the city like a shroud, I made my weary way through the tangled streets toward home. My shoulders ached beneath my heavy leather coat, and the curved beak of my mask seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. The day had been long. 6 households visited, 4 souls lost, 2 clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. I had dispensed what remedies I could, but in truth, I feared I was doing little more than offering false hope to the desperate. The cobblestones gleamed with the day's earlier rainfall, reflecting the dim light of lanterns hanging from doorways. Most windows were shuttered tight, as if the plague might seep through the smallest crack like a malevolent fog. The air smelled of wet stone and wood smoke, mingled with the ever-present undercurrent of decay that seemed to permeate every corner of the city. I turned down a narrow alleyway, a shortcut I often took in better times, when the main thoroughfares were crowded with merchants and their carts. Now the silence was broken only by the occasional scurrying of rats across my path. I watched them with weary eyes through the glass lenses of my mask. Even the rodents seemed fewer in number these days, a bitter irony that the very carriers of our destruction were themselves being consumed by it. Doctor, a voice called from the shadows, raspy and low. I paused, my hand instinctively moving to the staff at my side. Since the plague had taken hold, thieves had grown bolder, knowing the watch was spread thin, and many homes lay abandoned. Who calls? I asked, trying to pierce the darkness with my gaze. A figure emerged, clad in the dull gray uniform of the city watch. The torchlight from a nearby bracket illuminated his face in harsh relief, hollowed cheeks, sunken eyes, skin pale as parchment. I recognized him as Martin, a man I had treated months earlier for a broken arm suffered in a tavern brawl. "It's only me, sir," he said, approaching slowly. His eyes darted nervously from side to side, up to the rooftops and back to my mask. "You shouldn't be about past dark. Not tonight." "I go where I'm needed, Martin," I replied, relaxing my grip on my staff. "The sickness doesn't keep to daylight hours." He shook his head frantically, stepping closer. I could smell the sour wine on his breath. "Not talking about the plague, sir. Something else walks tonight." I sighed inwardly. Superstition had spread through the city nearly as quickly as the plague itself. Tales of demons and witchcraft abounded, the desperate masses eager to blame something, anything they could comprehend rather than an invisible miasma that struck without rhyme or reason. The plague is quite enough to contend with, I think, I said gently. We needn't invent new horrors. Martin's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. I saw it, sir. 2 nights past, near the eastern burial pit, a figure moving between the mounds. Not like a man, more like a shadow with substance. It stopped at each grave, bent down as if, his voice faltered. As if what, Martin? I asked, a flicker of unease stirring despite my skepticism. As if whispering to the dead, he finished, his voice barely audible. And then, sir, I swear by all that's holy, I heard answers coming from beneath the soil. I extricated my wrist from his grip gently. Fear had begun to rot the mind, just as the plague rotted the body. I'd seen it often in recent months, rational men driven to fantastical beliefs by the horrors they witnessed daily. You're exhausted, Martin. We all are. The mind plays tricks when deprived of proper rest. He laughed, a hollow sound that echoed off the narrow walls of the alley. That's what the captain said, but he didn't see Simmons this morning. Simmons, my fellow watchman, followed the shadow 2 nights ago after I'd fled. Found him at dawn, cold as stone by the pit. Not a mark on him, but his face. Martin shuddered visibly. His face was twisted in such terror, sir, like he'd seen the devil himself. A chill ran down my spine despite myself. Men died daily in this city. It hardly required supernatural explanation, and yet something in Martin's eyes gave me pause. Go home, doctor, he urged. Bar your door until morning. The sickness walks tonight, but not just the one we know. He backed away, his torch casting long distorted shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent life of their own. They say it comes for those who tend the sick, those who think they understand death's ways. With that cryptic warning, he turned and hurried off, his footsteps echoing in the empty street until silence once again claimed the night. I stood motionless for a long moment, watching the spot where he had disappeared. Logic told me to dismiss his ramblings as the product of an exhausted, fearful mind. I had witnessed similar delusions in others, a grasping for meaning in a world suddenly rendered incomprehensible by suffering, and yet, a nagging unease had taken root. I recalled the journal I'd found in the apothecary's shop, the strange warning about the doctor in red, and there was the matter of the apothecary's sudden disappearance, the ransacked shop. I shook my head, forcing such thoughts aside. This was the path to madness, seeing patterns where none existed, conspiracies and coincidence. I was a man of science, not superstition. The bells of the cathedral tolled in the distance, 8 chimes marking the hour. Night had fully claimed the city now, and with it came a deeper silence, as if the very air held its breath. I resumed my journey homeward, my footsteps quickening despite my rational mind's protestations. As I turned onto my street, I glimpsed movement from the corner of my eye, a flicker of crimson disappearing around a distant corner. I froze, heart suddenly pounding beneath my ribcage. A trick of the light, I murmured to myself. Nothing more. Yet I found myself hurrying to my door, fumbling with the key in the lock with fingers that suddenly seemed clumsy and foreign. Once inside, I secured the bolt with uncharacteristic haste, then stood in my darkened entryway, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing within the confines of my mask. Slowly, I removed the beaked contraption, feeling the cool air against my damp skin, the scent of dried herbs that filled the mask's beak. Rosemary, wormwood, mint lingered in my nostrils, a comforting reminder of rational precaution against miasmatic air. I moved through my chambers, lighting candles against the encroaching darkness. Their warm glow pushed back the shadows but couldn't quite dispel the uneasy feeling that had taken root since my encounter with the watchman. Tomorrow, I decided, I would inquire about the Simmons who had allegedly died near the eastern burial pit, not because I believed Martin's tale of whispering corpses and stalking shadows, but because any unusual death in these times warranted investigation. If nothing else, it might provide insight into a new manifestation of the plague. As I settled at my desk to record the day's observations in my journal, I couldn't help but glance toward the window. Outside, the city lay silent under a moonless sky, secrets hidden in its labyrinthine streets. Martin's warning echoed in my mind. The sickness walks tonight. I dipped my quill and began to write, pushing aside such fancies. Yet even as rational thought prevailed, I found myself listening intently to the sounds of the night, alert for any footstep that might pause outside my door. The carriage wheels groaned against the cobblestone path as I approached Lord Hartwood's estate on the outskirts of the city. The mansion loomed before me, a grand shadow against the fading twilight. Once, it had been the jewel of the countryside, but now ivy crept across its facade like hungry fingers, and the gardens had surrendered to wildness. As my boots crunched across the gravel, I noticed the unusual silence. No servants rushed to greet me. No stable boys appeared for my horse. I adjusted my mask, the leather beak stuffed with protective herbs and spices, rosemary, mint, cloves, and camphor. The familiar weight had become almost comforting in these dark days. My long black coat fluttered in the evening breeze as I ascended the marble steps, my doctor's bag heavy in my hand. The massive oak door stood slightly ajar. This was not how nobility received visitors, especially not in times of plague. I pushed it open with my cane, the creak echoing through the cavernous entrance hall. Lord Hartwood. My voice seemed to dissolve into the vastness of the mansion. Crystal chandeliers hung above, their candles unlit. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of dying sunlight that streamed through tall windows. "I am Dr. Thorne. I received your summons." No response came. The marble floors, once polished to a mirror shine, now bore a thin film of neglect. The portraits of Hartwood ancestors watched me with painted eyes as I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps the only sound besides the occasional creak of ancient wood. The drawing room was empty, tea settings abandoned mid-ceremony. A cup had fallen to its side, a dark stain spreading across an oriental carpet worth more than most men would see in a lifetime. I touched the teapot. It was cold. Upstairs came a feeble voice from somewhere above. "Please, hurry." I climbed the grand staircase, my hand sliding along the carved banister. The second floor was shrouded in near darkness, the corridors stretching like the limbs of some great beast. I followed the labored sound of breathing to the master chamber. Lord Hartwood lay in a four-poster bed, surrounded by velvet curtains drawn back to reveal his wasted form. Once a robust man known for his hunting prowess, he now resembled little more than a skeleton draped in fine silk nightclothes. His skin had the yellowish pallor I had come to know well, but his eyes, they burned with a fever unrelated to any plague I had encountered. "You've come," he whispered, his voice dry as autumn leaves. "Thank God." I set my bag beside his bed and began my examination, though I already knew what I would find. His pulse fluttered weakly beneath my fingers like a trapped bird. His breathing was shallow, the rattle of death already present in his lungs. "My lord, where are your servants? Your family?" I asked, preparing a tincture of valerian root to ease his pain. His fingers clutched my sleeve with surprising strength. "Gone, all gone." A spasm of coughing overtook him, and I waited as crimson flecked his lips. Some fled when the sickness came. Others I sent away. I helped him drink the tincture, supporting his head with my gloved hand. The room was oppressively silent, the usual bustle of a noble household conspicuously absent. No maids brought fresh linens. No footman tended the fire that had burned down to embers. "You should not be alone in this condition, my lord," I said. Though I had seen many die in solitude these past months, death was democratic that way. It came for peasants in crowded hovels and lords in grand mansions alike. "Better alone," he muttered, his gaze drifting to the far wall. Then with them, I followed his eyes to an ornate wooden door set into the wall, partially hidden behind a tapestry of a hunting scene. It was different from the other doors in the chamber, older with strange symbols carved into its frame. A heavy iron lock hung from its latch. "What lies beyond that door, my lord?" I asked, curiosity overcoming my professional reserve. His eyes widened, and he gripped my arm again. "Do not open it," he hissed. "For the love of God, do not open it." I nodded reassuringly. "I have no intention to, my lord. I am here for your care alone." Lord Hartwood's breathing eased slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on the door as if expecting it to open at any moment. "They whisper at night," he said after a long silence. "They scratch at the wood." A chill crept along my spine despite the rational part of my mind dismissing his words as fever dreams. I had heard similar tales from the dying, visions of demons, angels, lost loved ones. The veil between worlds seemed to thin around deathbeds. "Who whispers, my lord?" I asked gently, checking his temperature with the back of my hand. He burned like a forge. "My wife," he whispered. "My children. At least they wear their faces." His eyes locked with mine, suddenly clear and terribly sane. "But they are not my family. Not anymore. Not since they opened the box." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and rain began to patter against the tall windows. I moved to close the drapes against the gathering storm, but Lord Hartwood's panic stopped me. "No, leave them open. The darkness, it gives them strength." I obliged, returning to his bedside. "What box do you speak of, my lord?" His gaze darted around the room as if searching for eavesdroppers. "From the Orient," he whispered, "a curiosity brought by a sea captain who died the day after. I should have buried it unseen." But his voice trailed off, lost in regret. I prepared another draft, this one with powdered willow bark for his fever. Outside, the rain intensified, streams of water distorting the view of the gardens below. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, harsh flashes. "My family opened it 3 weeks past," Lord Hartwood continued. "That night, the dreams began. The next day, the first spots appeared on my daughter's neck. By sunset, my son could not rise from bed." His voice broke. "They died, doctor. They all died." But then, a particularly violent thunderclap shook the windows. In that moment I thought I heard scratching from behind the locked door. My pulse quickened, but I maintained my composure. "Then," I prompted, trying to keep his mind focused. "Then they returned," he whispered. "Changed, their eyes hollow, their voices wrong. They spoke of things they could not know, of places we have never been." His fingers dug into my arm. "I locked them in there 3 days ago. I had to. They are not my family anymore." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond to such delusions. Yet something in his earnestness gave me pause. The mansion's unnatural silence took on a more sinister quality in my mind. "The key," he said suddenly, fumbling beneath his pillow. He withdrew a large iron key, surprisingly heavy, as he pressed it into my palm. "If I die, when I die, you must not unlock that door. Take this key far from here. Cast it into the deepest river. Promise me." "I promise," I said, slipping the key into my coat pocket. Its weight seemed to pull at me like an anchor. Lord Hartwood settled back against his pillows, some tension leaving his frail body. "Good. That's good." He closed his eyes briefly. "You think me mad?" "I think you very ill, my lord," I answered diplomatically. "The fever often brings strange thoughts." He gave a weak laugh that dissolved into coughing. "Perhaps. Oh, how I hope you're right." I stayed with him through the night, administering what comfort my medicines could provide. The storm raged outside, but gradually his breathing eased into sleep. I dozed in the chair beside him, waking at intervals to check his condition. Near dawn, I was startled awake by silence. The rain had stopped, and so had Lord Hartwood's labored breathing. His face was peaceful in death, the lines of fear finally smoothed away. I closed his eyes gently and began gathering my things. As I prepared to leave, to summon the authorities, I cast one final glance at the locked door. In the gray light of early morning, I could have sworn I saw the handle turn slightly, though the lock held fast. I left quickly after that, the iron key heavy in my pocket as I ventured back into the awakening city, wondering what terrible secrets awaited me in the coming days as the plague's mysteries continued to unfold. As I made my way down the narrow, winding street, the fading light of dusk cast long shadows across the cobblestones. My leather boots echoed against the stones, the sound reverberating off the closely packed buildings that leaned toward one another, like old men sharing secrets. The scent of smoke hung in the air, mingling with the ever-present miasma of sickness that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I had received an unusual summons earlier that day, a small paint-stained parchment delivered by a gaunt boy who had disappeared into the mist before I could question him. The note bore only an address and a simple plea: come before nightfall, a final request. It was signed with a single letter, V. The street numbers grew smaller as I approached my destination, a timber-framed house wedged between a chandler's shop and what appeared to be an abandoned bakery. Unlike its neighbors, whose windows were shuttered tight against the plague, this building had a single window illuminated by the warm glow of candlelight. I hesitated at the door, adjusting my beaked mask, a constant companion these days, before rapping 3 times with my gloved knuckle. Enter, called a voice, thin and reedy, like a flute played by failing lungs. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a studio space that seemed to exist in defiance of death itself. Canvases were stacked against every wall, some covered in cloth, others exposed to reveal faces of all kinds: young, old, beautiful, plain, noble, and common, all painted with a delicate hand that captured not just their features, but something of their essence. The air was thick with the sharp smell of oils and turpentine, a welcome change from the stench of decay that permeated the rest of the city. You came, said the same voice, and I turned to find a frail man seated before an easel. His once fine clothes hung loosely on his diminished frame, and his fingers, stained with pigments of various hues, trembled slightly as he gestured for me to approach. I feared you might not. I am a doctor, I replied simply, moving closer. When summoned I come. A smile touched his lips, revealing teeth that had once been white, but were now yellowed with age and illness. Not as a doctor do I require you today, good sir, but as something far more precious, a subject. I frowned beneath my mask. I don't understand. Remove your mask, he instructed, indicating a chair positioned before his easel. Sit. Allow me to explain while I work. Time, I fear, is not a luxury I possess in abundance. Against my better judgment, against all medical wisdom, I removed my beaked mask and sat in the offered chair. The painter, Vittorio as he later introduced himself, nodded with satisfaction. Yes, he murmured, a face like yours must be remembered. I assure you there is nothing remarkable about my face, I said, uncomfortable under his intense scrutiny. Vittorio laughed, a sound that devolved into a cough he muffled with a paint-stained handkerchief. Forgive me, he said when he had recovered, but that is precisely what makes it remarkable. You have seen horrors daily, walked among the dying and the dead, and yet your eyes have not hardened. There is weariness, yes, but also compassion. Such a contradiction deserves immortality. He began to mix his paints, the scrape of his palette knife against the wooden surface, creating a rhythm that was strangely soothing. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the room as he worked. Outside, the last light of day surrendered to darkness, and the distant toll of the city bell marked the passing hours. I have painted many over the years, Vittorio said as he applied the first brushstrokes to his canvas. The wealthy, seeking to preserve their status for posterity. The beautiful, hoping to capture their fleeting youth. The powerful, desiring to be remembered as they wished to be seen, not as they were. He paused, studying me with eyes that, despite his illness, remained sharp and observant. but few have interested me as you do. Why? I asked, genuinely puzzled. Because you walk between worlds, he replied, his brush never ceasing its careful dance across the canvas. Between life and death, between science and superstition, between hope and despair. You are both cynic and believer, both healer and harbinger. You fascinate me. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, unused to such scrutiny. I am simply a man, doing what little I can in impossible circumstances. Are you? Vittorio mused, his head tilting slightly as he considered his work. I have heard stories about you, Doctor, about the houses you visit, and the secrets you uncover, about the questions you ask that others dare not voice. The studio suddenly felt smaller, more confined. What kind of stories? Vittorio smiled enigmatically. The kind that suggest you seek more than just cures for the body. Perhaps you seek truth as well. A silence fell between us, broken only by the soft whisper of bristles against canvas, and the occasional pop from the candle wicks as they burned down. I found myself studying the paintings that surrounded us, dozens of faces looking out from their wooden frames, each rendered with such care that they seemed almost alive. Among them, I noticed several that bore the fine clothes of nobility, and one face in particular caught my attention. A stern-looking man with cold eyes and a mouth set in a perpetual frown. You recognize him, Vittorio observed, following my gaze. Lord Blackwood, I replied. I attended his wife last month. She did not survive, and he sent you away with empty hands and harsh words, did he not? I turned sharply to face him. How could you know that? I know many things about the citizens of this city, both the living and the recently departed. He set down his brush and rubbed his hands together, as if to warm them. Faces reveal much to those who know how to look, Doctor, and I have spent a lifetime looking. As the night deepened around us, Vittorio continued to paint, pausing occasionally to cough or to rest his trembling hands. He spoke of his life, of the years spent traveling across Europe, studying under masters and painting the faces of kings and courtiers. He spoke of the beauty he had witnessed, and the ugliness too, the way power corrupted, the way wealth blinded, the way fear transformed even the kindest souls into monsters. This plague, he said softly, it has shown us all for what we truly are. Some rise to heights of heroism, others sink to depths of depravity, and some, he fixed me with a penetrating gaze, some seek answers where others fear to look. The candles had burned low when he finally set down his brush with a sigh of satisfaction. It is not my finest work. My hands are not what they once were, but it will serve. He gestured for me to approach, and I rose stiffly from my chair, my limbs protesting after hours of stillness. The portrait he had created was startling in its honesty. He had captured not just my features but the exhaustion in my eyes, the determination in the set of my jaw, the grief etched into the lines of my face. It was uncomfortably revealing, as if he had somehow painted not just my appearance, but my very thoughts. Take it, Vittorio said, carefully detaching the canvas from his easel. Consider it payment for the visit you are about to make. I don't understand. He pressed the painting into my hands. You will, and when you visit the address written on the back of this canvas tomorrow, remember that not all poison comes in vials, Doctor. Some comes from the lips of trusted men. I turned the canvas over to find an address scrawled in red paint across the wooden frame. When I looked up to question him further, I found Vittorio slumped in his chair, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. Vittorio, I stepped toward him, my physician's instincts taking over. His eyes fluttered open. Fear not, Doctor. Death and I are old acquaintances merely preparing for a formal introduction. A faint smile touched his lips. Go now, take the portrait and heed my warning. The doctor in red awaits you, though perhaps not in the way you expect. I gathered my mask and bag, reluctant to leave him alone in his final hours but sensing that was what he wished. At the door I turned back one last time. Vittorio, "How did you know about the doctor in red?" His answer came as a whisper that seemed to hang in the air long after I had closed the door behind me and stepped back into the night. "Because I painted him too, Doctor, and unlike you, his eyes were cold as a winter grave." I stood alone in the abandoned apothecary shop, a silence pressing against my ears like cotton wool. The owner, Master Ambrose, had vanished 3 days prior, another mystery in a city already drowning in them. His disappearance troubled me deeply. We had worked together for years, sharing knowledge of herbs and remedies that had saved countless lives before this plague descended upon us. The shop smelled of sage, rosemary, and something sharper. Perhaps fear itself had a scent. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of afternoon light that managed to pierce through the grime-covered windows. I had come seeking more supplies, perhaps answers, but found only abandonment. My leather boots creaked against the wooden floorboards as I moved deeper into the shop. Glass vials stood in neat rows upon the shelves, their contents gleaming amber, emerald, and ruby in the dim light. Labels written in Master Ambrose's careful script identified tinctures of foxglove, preparations of willow bark, and powders of dried mandrake root. I ran my gloved finger along them, leaving a clean trail through the thin layer of dust. "Ambrose," I whispered, though I knew no answer would come. "What happened to you, old friend?" The silence swallowed my words whole. I moved toward the back room, where Ambrose kept his private study. The door stood slightly ajar, unusual, as he had always kept it locked. My heart quickened its pace beneath my heavy black robes. Something was indeed amiss. With gentle pressure from my fingertips, the door swung open with a low groan of protest. The study beyond was in disarray, so unlike the meticulous Ambrose I had known. Books lay scattered across the floor, their spines broken, pages torn. His writing desk had been overturned, inkwells shattered against the floorboards, their contents dried into dark stains like spilled blood. "Who did this?" I murmured to the empty room, my voice barely audible above the soft rustling of my robes. As I stepped carefully around the debris, my eyes were drawn to a small alcove in the far corner of the room, a space I had never noticed in my previous visits. The wooden paneling had been pulled away, revealing a small hidden compartment. A single leather-bound journal remained within, untouched by the destruction that had befallen the rest of the study. With trembling hands, I retrieved the book. Its leather binding was worn smooth from years of handling, the pages yellowed with age. I sank down into Ambrose's reading chair, the only piece of furniture still upright, and opened the journal with reverent care. The first pages contained recipes familiar to me: remedies for fever, poultices for wounds, tinctures to ease pain. Ambrose's handwriting was neat and precise, detailing ingredients and their proper measures. But as I turned the pages, the writing grew more hurried, the remedies more unusual: extract of nightshade, mixed with powdered batwing, and the blood of a black hen. I read aloud, my brow furrowing beneath the weight of my plague mask. To be administered under the full moon, while reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards. Such a concoction was more akin to witchcraft than medicine. Ambrose had always been a man of science, scoffing at the superstitions that ran rampant through the fearful populace. What had driven him to record such things? I turned another page, and another. The recipes grew stranger still, calling for ingredients I had never heard of: tears of the innocent, ashes of a hanged man, water from a drowned sailor's lungs. These were not the writings of the rational man I had known. The candle beside me guttered as a draft swept through the room. Outside, the sky had darkened, not with approaching night, but with storm clouds that promised rain. The air felt heavy, charged with something more than just moisture. I pulled my robes tighter around me, fighting a chill that seemed to emanate from the book itself, rather than the weather. The final entries were dated just before Ambrose's disappearance. The handwriting had deteriorated further, becoming almost frantic, the ink blotched where his pen had pressed too hard against the paper. I have seen him again today. The passage read, "The doctor in red. He stands across the street, watching my shop, watching me. The others cannot see him, or pretend they cannot, but I know what he is. I know what he brings." A crack of thunder made me start, nearly dropping the journal. Rain began to patter against the windows, softly at first, then with increasing urgency, as if nature itself were trying to warn me of something. I returned to the journal, turning to the final page. There, written in large shaky letters that filled the entire page, was a single sentence: "Do not trust the doctor in red." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I remembered the whisperings I had heard over the past weeks, rumors of a strange physician, clad in crimson robes, who appeared where the plague was most virulent. Some spoke of him with hope, claiming he offered cures where others had failed, but others spoke with fear, noting that where he walked, death followed more swiftly. I had dismissed such talk as the ramblings of frightened minds, desperate to find meaning in chaos. But now, holding Ambrose's journal, I was no longer certain. Beneath the warning was a smaller note, written in a hand almost too small to read. "The truth lies beneath St. Cyprian's church, the 7th stone from the altar, on the left side. God forgive me for what I've done." Rain lashed against the windows now, driven by a howling wind that seemed to carry voices within it. The candle flame danced wildly, casting monstrous shadows across the walls of the study. I closed the journal and slipped it inside my robes, close to my heart. Whatever secrets Ambrose had uncovered, whatever had driven him to flee, or worse, the answers appeared to lie beneath the stones of St. Cyprian's. The church stood in the old quarter, a place I had avoided these past weeks, as the plague had taken firm hold there. To venture into such a hotbed of disease was to court death itself, and yet, what choice did I have? If there was truth to be found, if there was something more to this plague than mere disease, did I not have a duty to uncover it? I rose from the chair, the leather of my mask creaking as I surveyed the ruined study one final time. There would be no more supplies to be gathered here, only questions without answers. The storm outside had reached its full fury, now rain hammering against the roof, like the impatient fingers of the dead. "I will find your truth, Ambrose," I promised the empty air, "and if this doctor in red is indeed something to be feared, I shall discover what can be done about him." With that vow upon my lips, I pulled my hood lower over my mask and prepared to step back into the rain-soaked streets. St. Cyprian's church awaited, and with it, perhaps, the answers to the mysteries that had begun to swirl around me, like the approaching storm. The 7th stone from the altar, on the left side. What secrets might lie beneath? As I reached for the door handle, a flash of crimson caught my eye, a brief glimpse of red fabric through the rain-streaked window. There and gone in an instant. My heart froze in my chest. Had he found me already? Was he watching even now? Only one way to find out. I steadied my nerve, clutched the journal tighter beneath my robes, and stepped out into the deluge. The summons came at the most unholy hour, when the shadows stretched long and thin across the cobblestones. I had only just returned to my quarters, my bones weary from a day of tending to the sick and the dying. The parchment was slipped beneath my door. No messenger, no knock, just the faint scratching of paper against wood that roused me from near slumber. I unfolded the note with fingers still stained with herbal tinctures. The writing was spidery, faint, as if penned by a hand that trembled with each stroke. "The house at the end of Blackthorn Lane requires your services, doctor. Come alone." Come tonight. No signature graced the bottom of the page. No seal or mark to identify the sender. Just those words, those beckoning words that stirred something deep within my chest, something I had not felt in years of treating the plague-ridden. Curiosity. Blackthorn Lane. Even in the days before the pestilence, it was a place of ill repute. Now it was all but abandoned. The last remaining holdouts, either too stubborn or too poor to seek refuge elsewhere. And at its end stood a house that even the desperate avoided. A 3-story structure of weathered stone and rotting timber that seemed to lean inward upon itself, as if collapsing under the weight of its own dark history. Fool's errand, I muttered to myself as I gathered my physician's bag and donned my protective garb, the thick, waxed coat, the gloves, the hat, and the mask. Oh, the mask, that beaked visage that had become as much a symbol of death as the disease itself. I filled the beak with dried rosemary, lavender, and cloves, protection against the miasma, or so we physicians convinced ourselves. The streets were empty as I made my journey, save for the occasional rat scurrying from shadow to shadow. The moon hung low and swollen in the night sky, bathing the city in a sickly yellow glow that turned familiar buildings into crouching beasts. My footsteps echoed hollowly against the stone, each one a reminder that I walked alone through a city of ghosts. Blackthorn Lane appeared as if from nowhere, a narrow passage between 2 leaning buildings that seemed to materialize from the fog. The cobblestones here were uneven, treacherous in the dim light, and slick with a substance I dared not contemplate. The houses lining the lane were shuttered tight, not a single candle burning in their windows, save one. At the very end of the lane, where the path dissolved into the tangled undergrowth of the old city wall, stood the house. 3 stories of mismatched stone and timber, windows like hollow eyes staring out into the night, and in one window, the highest, a small dormer jutting from the slate roof, burned a single candle, its flame steady despite the night's chill breeze. I stood before the iron gate, rusted and hanging from a single hinge, and felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me. The house seemed to breathe, to shift ever so slightly in the moonlight, as if adjusting itself to better observe the masked figure standing at its threshold. Come no further if you value your soul, doctor. The voice startled me, a rasp from the shadows to my left. I turned to find an old woman, bent nearly double with age, her face a map of deep lines and sunken hollows. She clutched a gnarled walking stick in one hand, the other raised in warning. I was summoned, I replied, my voice muffled behind my mask. Someone within requires medical attention. The old woman spat upon the ground. Aye, and the devil requires sinners, but I don't see good folk lining up at the gates of hell. That house, she shook her head, the few wisps of white hair dancing about her face. 3 families have died within those walls since the sickness came, but they didn't die of the plague. Mark my words. What killed them then? I asked, despite myself. The house itself, she whispered, leaning closer. I could smell the sour wine on her breath. It feeds on them, draws the life from their bodies until they're nothing but husks, empty things with eyes that still move. I had heard such superstitions before. Fear bred fantastic tales in times of pestilence. I am a physician, I said firmly. I deal in science, not ghost stories. The old woman cackled, a sound like dry leaves rustling. Science? What good is your science against that which has no natural cause? Go then, doctor. Go and see for yourself, but remember my warning when you feel it begin to feed on you as well. With those words she melted back into the shadows, the tapping of her walking stick fading until I stood alone once more before the cursed house. I pushed open the gate, wincing at the screech of metal against stone. The small garden before the house was overgrown, choked with weeds and the skeletal remains of what might once have been roses. The stone path leading to the door was cracked, with pale mushrooms growing in the fissures. Death caps, my mind noted absently, poisonous. As I approached the door, the air grew colder, heavy with the scent of rot and something else, something sweet and cloying that caught in the back of my throat. My hand hesitated above the tarnished knocker, shaped like the head of a raven. Before I could bring it down, the door creaked open on its own. Darkness greeted me, a yawning void broken only by the faint glow of embers in a distant hearth. And then a voice, soft, frail, like the rustling of parchment. "Enter, doctor. I have waited so long for you." I stepped across the threshold, my physician's instincts overriding the primal fear that clawed at my spine. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots, a sound like pain given voice. The door swung shut behind me, and I fought the urge to turn and flee. "Where are you?" I called, my eyes still adjusting to the gloom. "Show yourself so that I might help you." A soft laugh echoed from somewhere above. "Help me? Yes, perhaps you can. Follow the light, doctor. Come to me." A candle flared to life at the foot of a winding staircase to my right, though I saw no hand that lit it. Then another, higher up the stairs, and another after that, creating a trail of flickering light that led upward into the belly of the house. I hesitated only a moment before following, my bag clutched tightly in one hand, the other trailing along the wall for support. The house seemed to shift around me as I climbed, the walls breathing in and out with slow, deliberate movements. A trick of the light, I told myself, nothing more. The stairs ended at a long corridor lined with closed doors, all save one, the last door on the left, which stood ajar, golden light spilling from within. As I moved toward it, the floorboards creaking a warning beneath my feet, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched from behind each closed door I passed. "I am here," called the voice, stronger now. "I am waiting." I paused before the open door, gathered my courage and stepped through. What awaited me within would forever change my understanding of our mortal world and what lies beyond its veil. I had just finished recording the day's observations in my journal when the first toll of the midnight bell reached my ears. The sound was familiar, yet somehow different, heavier, more resonant. I paused, quill hovering above parchment, as the second toll followed. Each ring seemed to linger in the air longer than natural, as if reluctant to fade into the night. My chambers felt suddenly cold. I had been tracking the plague's path through the city for weeks now, mapping its cruel progress street by street, home by home. Logic and observation were my companions, my shields against the tide of superstition that swept through the frightened populace. Yet something about this midnight toll unsettled me. 3, 4, 5. The bells continued. I rose from my desk, my joints stiff from hours of sitting. The candle's flame danced as I moved toward the window, casting elongated shadows across my medical texts and herb-filled jars. Outside, the city lay shrouded in a thin mist, the streets empty save for the occasional rats scurrying between shadows. Most windows were dark, the living asleep, the dying too weak to light their candles. 6, 7, 8. Something was not right. The bell tower keeper, old Jacob, had succumbed to the plague 3 days prior. His apprentice, a boy of no more than 15 years, had fled the city with his mother. No one had been appointed to ring the bells. They should have remained silent tonight. 9, 10, 11. I slipped my plague mask over my face, more from habit than necessity, and secured my heavy black cloak around my shoulders. The night air would be cold, especially in the elevated bell tower. My wooden cane tapped against the stone floor as I made my way down the narrow staircase of my lodgings. 12. The final toll seemed to hang in the air, as if suspended by invisible threads. The streets were eerily silent as I walked. My footsteps echoed between the buildings, the sound bouncing off shuttered windows and barred doors. Occasionally, I heard coughing from within a home, that distinctive hollow cough that signaled the plague's iron grip on a victim's lungs. I quickened my pace. The tower loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the night sky. The Church of St. Bartholomew had stood for 3 centuries, its bell tower the tallest structure in our city. During better times, it had marked the hours of prayer, celebrations, and the passing of our most esteemed citizens. Now it mostly tolled for the dead, so many that individual rings had been replaced by a single daily bell to acknowledge the mounting losses. The massive wooden door to the church creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the sanctuary was illuminated only by a few eternal flames near the altar, casting long shadows across the empty pews. The scent of incense lingered, mingled with the mustiness of old stone and damp wood. My footsteps echoed as I crossed the nave toward the small door that led to the bell tower stairs. The stairway was pitch black. I retrieved a small lantern from my bag, striking flint against steel until the wick caught. The narrow, spiraling stone steps stretched upward, disappearing into darkness beyond my lantern's glow. I began to climb, my breath creating small clouds in the cold air. 107 steps. I had counted them once years ago when I had accompanied the bishop to inspect the tower after a lightning strike. My legs ached by the 50th step, my breathing growing labored. Age had not been kind to my body, and the constant walking through the city streets to tend to the sick had left me perpetually tired. As I neared the top, a cold draft slithered down the stairwell. The wind often found its way through the tower's ancient stones, but this chill felt different, more deliberate, as if seeking me out. I pulled my cloak tighter and continued upward. Finally, I emerged onto the bell chamber platform. My lantern illuminated the massive bronze bell suspended from ancient oak beams. It hung motionless now, silent. The rope that would normally be used to ring it swayed gently in the night air, though there was barely a breeze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing off the stone walls. "Is anyone here?" Only silence answered me. I moved closer to the bell, raising my lantern to examine it. The bronze surface reflected the light, showing no signs of recent use, yet I had heard it clearly. 12 distinct tolls marking midnight. I reached out to touch the bell's surface. It was cold, colder than it should have been even on this chilly night. As my fingers made contact with the metal, I felt a subtle vibration, like the last remnant of a sound long since faded. Moving to the edge of the platform, I looked out over the sleeping city. From this height, the streets formed a dark maze, interrupted occasionally by the glow of a watchman's lantern or a light from a window where someone tended to the sick. The mist had thickened, pooling in the lower parts of the city like a silvery lake. The rope swayed again, this time more noticeably. I turned quickly, holding my lantern higher. There was no one there, no sign that anyone had been in the tower recently. The thick layer of dust on the wooden floor showed only my own footprints, yet the rope moved as if recently pulled. I watched transfixed as it swung in a gentle arc, defying the stillness of the air around it. "This is madness," I muttered to myself. There must be a draft. I was a man of science after all. I had studied in Bologna, learned from the greatest anatomists of our age. I had dissected corpses to understand how the body worked, had read the ancient texts of Galen and Avicenna. There was always a rational explanation even for the seemingly inexplicable. As I stood contemplating the moving rope, a sound reached my ears, faint at first, then growing clearer. Whispering, multiple voices, indistinct yet unmistakably human, seemed to emanate from the bell itself. I stepped closer, my lantern held high. The voices grew louder, though I could not make out what they were saying. It sounded like dozens of people speaking simultaneously, their words overlapping in a cacophony of urgent murmurs. The rope swung more vigorously now, though still not enough to make the bell toll. I backed away, my heart pounding beneath my ribs. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Suddenly the voices ceased. The rope stilled. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the whispers had been. I stood motionless for several long minutes, waiting for the phenomenon to repeat. Nothing happened. The bell tower remained still and silent, as it should have been all along. Eventually, I convinced myself that fatigue had clouded my senses. The stress of fighting the plague day after day, watching helplessly as it claimed more lives despite my best efforts. It was bound to affect my mind eventually. As I turned to leave, my lantern illuminated something on the floor that I had missed before. A small piece of red fabric lay near the base of the bell, bright against the gray stone. I bent to pick it up, rubbing the material between my fingers. It was fine silk, dyed a deep crimson, expensive material, the kind used in garments of the wealthy or in ceremonial robes. I tucked it into my pocket, a tangible reminder that my experience had been real, not a product of an exhausted mind. As I descended the tower steps considerably faster than I had climbed them, I could not shake the feeling that something had changed tonight. Some threshold had been crossed. The streets were still empty as I made my way back to my lodgings, though I could have sworn I glimpsed a figure in red disappearing around a dissipating corner. By the time I reached the intersection, there was no one to be seen. Sleep would not come easily tonight. I had a growing sense that the plague was merely one manifestation of something darker taking hold in our city, something that perhaps could not be fought with herbal remedies and bloodletting. The mysterious doctor in red, the whispering dead, and now a bell that tolled without a ringer. These pieces formed a puzzle I could not yet solve. Tomorrow I would seek out the cursed house at the end of the street. Perhaps there I might find answers to questions I was only beginning to formulate. The last crimson rays of sunset had long since disappeared behind the city walls. When I made my way toward the outskirts, where the mass burial pits lay, a thin mist hovered low to the ground, swirling around my leather boots as I walked the deserted path that had, over these past months, been worn smooth by the constant procession of the death carts. I had spent the afternoon tending to a merchant's family, all stricken with the telltale signs, the blackened lymph nodes, the fever that burned like hellfire, yet left them shivering. 3 children and their mother. The father had already succumbed 3 days prior. I carried their fate in my leather satchel, notes of those who would likely not see the next dawn, records to be delivered to the gravekeeper. Such was my duty beyond mere treatment. I was also a chronicler of the dying. The pale moon hung overhead, a perfect silver disk in the clear night sky, casting the burial grounds in a ghostly illumination that required no torch. I had come to appreciate these late-night journeys, the city's panic and desperation temporarily suspended in the darkness, leaving only an eerie stillness that, despite everything, brought me a measure of peace. Dr. Rivo, the gravekeeper's voice called out as I approached the wooden hut that served as his shelter. Jacob was a thin, wiry man, with skin like tanned leather, and eyes that had seen too much death to maintain any semblance of light within them. I did not expect anyone at this hour. These cannot wait until morning, I said, withdrawing the folded parchments from my satchel. The alderman has demanded accurate counts by dawn. Jacob nodded grimly, accepting the papers with a hesitant hand. You'd best be gone soon, doctor. The night grows late, and he paused, his gaze drifting toward the largest of the burial pits some 50 yards away. And, I prompted, noticing the unusual tension in his weathered face. Strange things happen here after dark, he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. Things I cannot explain. I sighed inwardly. Superstition had gripped the city as tightly as the plague itself. The dead are dead, Jacob. They hold no power over the living. So I once believed, he replied, his voice barely audible. But I have heard them, doctor, whispering, calling names. Sometimes I think they're trying to rise. I should have dismissed his words as the ramblings of a man who spent too much time alone among corpses, but something in his expression, a raw, unfiltered fear, gave me pause. Jacob was not a man given to flights of fancy. He had buried hundreds, perhaps thousands, without complaint. "Show me," I said, surprising even myself with the request. Jacob shook his head firmly. "I will not stay after the bell tolls 9, Doctor. Not anymore." He gestured toward the largest pit with a trembling hand. "But if you must know, that's where they speak the loudest." The gravekeeper retreated to his hut, bolting the door behind him. I stood alone, the weight of my beaked mask suddenly heavier upon my face. Logic told me to return to the city, to my small quarters where dried herbs and burning candles kept the stench of death temporarily at bay. Yet curiosity, that dangerous companion to scientific minds, beckoned me forward. The burial pit loomed before me, a vast wound in the earth some 20 feet deep and twice as wide. Hundreds of bodies had been laid here, stacked upon one another with only a thin dusting of lime between layers. The most recent additions were still visible at the top, awaiting tomorrow's covering of soil. A sudden breeze swept across the field, carrying with it the unmistakable odor of decay, despite the lime. I pulled my handkerchief, soaked in vinegar and rosemary, from my pocket and pressed it against the beak of my mask, though the herbs and dried flowers packed inside already filtered the worst of it. As I stood at the edge of the pit, the silence seemed to deepen around me. The distant sounds of the city, even the occasional toll of the bell, faded into nothingness. There was only the soft rustle of my robes in the breeze and the steady rhythm of my own breathing within the confines of my mask. Then I saw it, a subtle shift in the soil near the center of the pit. At first, I convinced myself it was merely settling earth, the natural compression of bodies and soil. But then it happened again, more pronounced this time, as if something below was moving. "Methane," I whispered to myself, the scientific explanation providing momentary comfort. "The bodies decompose, releasing gas that shifts the earth." But even as the words left my lips, I heard it, a sound so faint that I might have imagined it had I not been utterly alone in the stillness. A whisper, not the wind, not the rustle of leaves, a human whisper, words too indistinct to comprehend but unmistakably formed by human lips. And then another, and another, rising from the pit like steam, a chorus of hushed voices speaking words I could not, perhaps did not want to understand. I stepped back, nearly losing my footing. Logic warred with the evidence of my senses. I was a man of science, trained in the medical arts in Montpellier. I had dissected cadavers, witnessed death in all its forms. The dead do not speak, yet the whispers continued, growing neither louder nor softer but maintaining their ghostly presence at the edge of hearing. And as I stood transfixed, I noticed something else. The ground was moving again, but this time in a pattern. The soil rose and fell in places, like the chest of a sleeping giant taking shallow breaths. "Doctor," a voice called from behind me, and I nearly leapt from my skin. It was Jacob, standing halfway between his hut and where I stood, his face pale in the moonlight. "The bell has tolled 9. We must go, now." As if punctuating his urgency, a louder sound emerged from the pit, not a whisper now, but a moan, low and sustained, filled with such profound sorrow that it seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Jacob was already retreating, making the sign of the cross repeatedly across his chest. I stood frozen for one moment longer, watching as a hand, blackened and twisted but unmistakably human, emerged slightly from the soil before disappearing again. Science abandoned me then. I turned and fled, my boots pounding against the hard-packed earth as I raced after Jacob toward the city gates. I did not look back, but the whispers followed me, clinging to my consciousness like the miasma of disease that hung over the city. Back within the city walls, I paused to catch my breath, my rational mind already attempting to explain away what I had witnessed. Exhaustion, perhaps, the strain of weeks spent among the dying, maybe even the early signs of the illness itself affecting my senses. But deep within, in that place where truth resides untainted by our desperate need for rational explanation, I knew what I had seen was real. The dead were restless, and they were speaking. As I made my way through the deserted streets toward my lodgings, a new thought emerged, one that would lead me to the cathedral at first light. For if the dead could whisper, what secrets might they be trying to share? What knowledge of the plague might they possess that the living had yet to discover? The night's revelation would guide my steps tomorrow, drawing me deeper into a mystery that science alone could not explain. But for now, I needed rest, though I suspected sleep would prove elusive with the memory of those whispers still echoing in my ears. The evening mist had just begun to settle over the cobblestones as I made my way back from the Eastern District. My leather boots clicked against the worn stones, echoing through the empty streets. Though the plague had been ravaging our city for months, there was something different about this particular evening, a heaviness in the air that pressed against my chest like a physical weight. I adjusted my mask, the long beak stuffed with dried rosemary, juniper berries, and wormwood. The herbs had lost their potent scent hours ago, but I dared not remove the protective covering. Too many of my colleagues had fallen prey to the disease. After growing complacent, I wouldn't make the same mistake. The narrow street opened into a small square, where the old fountain stood dry and neglected. Water had been deemed unsafe since the outbreak began. Fear of miasma and corrupted vapors had turned even the most basic necessities into potential harbingers of death. I paused to consult my journal, flipping through pages of observations and failed treatments by the dim light of a nearby torch. That's when I felt it, the peculiar sensation of being watched. Slowly, I lifted my gaze from my journal. Through the eye holes of my mask, across the square, a figure stood perfectly still beneath the shadow of an archway. Unlike my dark attire, this stranger wore robes of deep crimson that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the day. And that mask, similar to mine in shape, but adorned with strange symbols I couldn't decipher from this distance. Another plague doctor. I had heard rumors of physicians arriving from various parts of Europe, bringing their own methods and beliefs, but something about this one felt wrong. No doctor I knew would choose such a color. Red, the color of blood and fever. "Hail, colleague," I called out, my voice muffled by my mask. The figure made no response, no movement, no acknowledgement. I took a cautious step forward, and the crimson doctor tilted his head slightly, the long beak of his mask catching the fading light. Despite the distance between us, I could feel his eyes studying me, assessing me as one might examine a patient's symptoms. "I am Dr. Thomas Marlowe," I announced, taking another step. "Are you newly arrived to our city? Perhaps we could exchange observations on the pestilence." Still nothing, only that unnerving, unwavering stare. A church bell tolled somewhere in the distance, marking the hour. 6 chimes. Soon the city watch would begin their rounds, enforcing the curfew established to contain the spread of disease. I needed to return to my lodgings, yet I found myself unable to turn away from this strange figure. The Red Doctor finally moved, a slow, deliberate lifting of one gloved hand, pointing directly at me. The gesture sent an unexpected chill down my spine. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice stronger than I felt. The stranger lowered his hand and turned, walking with unhurried steps toward a side street. I called out, surprising myself with my own impulsivity. "Who are you?" Before I could decide whether to follow, a cart rumbled into the square from another street. The driver, an old man with a scarf covering the lower half of his face, paid me no mind as he guided his horse across the cobblestones. The interruption lasted only moments, but when I looked back to where the Red Doctor had been, the archway stood empty. I hurried toward the side street, my medical bag clutched tightly against my side. The narrow passage twisted between tall buildings, windows shuttered against both night and disease. The mist had grown thicker here, swirling around my ankles like spectral hands grasping at my boots. My voice sounded small in the confines of the alley. "Fellow physician." Nothing but silence answered me. I continued forward, driven by curiosity, and an inexplicable sense of importance. The Red Doctor seemed to know me, or at least he had singled me out specifically. In my months of battling this plague, I had encountered many strange things, but nothing that had unnerved me quite like this. The alley opened onto another street, this one wider and lined with the homes of merchants who had either fled the city or perished within these very walls. Candles burned in only 2 or 3 windows, small beacons of life in an otherwise abandoned quarter, and there, a flash of crimson disappearing around a corner. I quickened my pace, my breath growing labored within the confines of my mask. The warm evening air combined with my exertion was causing droplets of sweat to trickle down my temples. I rounded the corner just in time to see the red figure standing at the center of a crossroads, motionless once more. This time, I approached more cautiously. "I mean you no harm," I said, though I wondered if the same could be said of him. "Are you a physician? Or perhaps an apothecary?" The Red Doctor's head tilted again, as if considering my questions. Then with deliberate slowness, he reached into his robes and withdrew something. I tensed, but what he held out was merely a small leather-bound book, similar to my own medical journal. "You have observations to share?" I asked, hope momentarily overriding my apprehension. Any new insights into the plague could save countless lives. He extended the book toward me, and I approached with caution. When I was within arm's reach, he dropped the journal to the ground between us. Without thinking, I bent to retrieve it, and when I straightened again, the Red Doctor was gone. I spun around, searching the 4 streets that met at this crossroads. Empty, all of them, no sign of movement, no flutter of crimson robes. It was as if he had simply vanished into the mist that now curled around my legs like a living thing. With trembling hands, I opened the journal. The pages were filled with a cramped, meticulous script, diagrams of the human body with strange markings circling various organs. Some pages contained what appeared to be recipes for medicines, but with ingredients I had never encountered in my studies. And there, on the final page, a message that made my blood run cold. "You follow the wrong path, Thomas Marlowe. Your remedies only hasten the journey to the grave. I have watched your failures mount. Soon I will collect what remains." I snapped the book shut, my heart pounding against my ribs. How did this stranger know my name? How had he been observing my work without my knowledge? The church bells rang again, a warning this time. 7 chimes. The watch would be making their rounds soon. I needed to return to my lodgings, to safety, to think through what had just happened. As I hurried through the darkening streets, the journal clutched tightly in my hand. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from every shadow. The buildings loomed taller in the growing darkness, and the mist continued to thicken, obscuring the path ahead. What did the Red Doctor want with me? Was he truly a physician with different methods, or something else entirely? The plague had brought many opportunists to our city, charlatans selling false cures, thieves preying on the vulnerable, even those who believed the disease was a divine punishment for which they were the appointed executioners. Tomorrow I would need to speak with the city magistrate about this encounter, but tonight I would study this journal, seeking to understand the mind of the man who had been watching me, for I knew with grim certainty that this would not be our last encounter. The Red Doctor was hunting me now, and I needed to discover why before he found me again. The day had worn me thin, like an old cloth used too many times to polish silver. My quarters welcomed me with familiar shadows. As I pushed open the heavy oak door, the single candle I had left burning had created a small pool of amber light on my writing desk, barely illuminating the scattered papers and worn leather-bound journals. I hung my beaked mask on its hook by the door, grateful to be free of its weight, if only for a few precious hours. The herbs packed inside, rosemary, wormwood, and dried roses, had perfumed my face throughout the day, the scent now seemingly embedded in my very skin. I sighed deeply as I removed my heavy leather gloves, placing them beside a mortar and pestle, still crusted with yesterday's herbal preparations. My fingers ached from the countless pulses I had taken, the countless foreheads I had touched, searching for the fever that almost always meant doom. 23 homes visited today, 8 new cases, 5 already dead when I arrived. 1 more day survived. I muttered to myself, a ritual I had developed since the plague first darkened our city gates. Each night, I spoke these words, half prayer and half astonishment that I remained among the living. As I moved toward my small wash basin, my boot caught on something that slid across the floorboards with a whisper. I looked down, narrowing my tired eyes in the dim light. A folded piece of parchment had been slipped beneath my door. The sight of it caused my heart to quicken, a reaction born from months of letters, bringing only news of death and desperation. I bent to retrieve it, noting the quality of the paper immediately. This was not the rough, cheap parchment used for official notices or desperate pleas from the poor quarters. This was fine vellum, smooth to the touch, the kind used in the homes of merchants and nobility. I turned it over in my hands, finding no seal, no mark to indicate its sender. With careful fingers, I broke the simple fold and held the letter closer to the candle flame. The handwriting flowed across the page in elegant, educated strokes, not the labored script of someone barely literate, but the confident hand of one well-versed in correspondence. You seek answers where others find only questions, the letter began, making me draw a sharp breath. The plague that ravages our city is not what the church claims, nor what your medical texts describe. If truth still matters in these dark days, meet me at midnight in the abandoned chapel at the edge of the city. Come alone and tell no one. You will learn the truth about the plague. There was no signature, no mark of identification. I read the words again, then a third time, as if the parchment might reveal more secrets with each pass of my eyes. The abandoned chapel. I knew it well. A small stone structure that had once served the farmers and travelers beyond the city walls. When the plague arrived, the chapel had been closed, its priest having fled or perished like so many others. Now it stood empty, its bell silent, its doors barred. I placed the letter on my desk and poured water from a copper pitcher into my basin. The cool liquid against my face provided momentary relief from the weight of the day, and now, the weight of this mysterious summons. As I dried my face with a linen cloth, I glanced at the small timepiece on my shelf. Nearly 10 of the clock. Midnight approached more quickly than I would have liked. Was this a trap? Perhaps. The plague had brought out desperate acts from desperate people. Some blamed physicians for the spread of the disease, believing our masked appearances and foreign remedies did more harm than good. Yet the handwriting, the quality of the paper, these spoke of education, of means. The truth about the plague, I whispered, the words hanging in the still air of my chamber. I moved to the small hearth and stirred the dying embers with an iron poker. A meager flame rose up, casting long shadows across the floor. I added a few pieces of kindling, watching as they caught and crackled. The warmth reached out to me, a small comfort in a world grown cold with fear and loss. My stomach reminded me I had eaten little that day. From my stores, I took a piece of hard cheese and a crust of bread that had seen better days. I chewed slowly, contemplating the letter and its implications. If there was indeed some hidden truth about the plague, did I not have a duty to discover it? Had I not sworn an oath to heal, to understand the ailments that afflicted the body? Yet midnight, the abandoned chapel, the secrecy of it all carried the scent of danger as surely as my mask carried the scent of protective herbs. I moved to my small window and pushed open the shutters. The night air rushed in, cool and damp against my face. The city lay before me, a sprawling darkness punctuated by the occasional torch or lantern. In the distance, the edge of the forest marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness. Somewhere there, the abandoned chapel waited. The bell in the town square struck the hour. 11 chimes echoed across the rooftops. 1 hour remained. I closed the shutters and returned to my desk, lifting the mysterious letter once more. The words seemed to shimmer in the candlelight, promising knowledge, promising truth. In my profession, truth was as valuable as any herb or remedy, perhaps more so. With a resolved breath, I reached for my traveling cloak, a dark woolen garment that had served me well on countless journeys through the city's plague-ridden streets. If I left now, I could reach the chapel by midnight, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the night watch that enforced the curfew. I hesitated at the hook where my mask hung. Should I wear it? The beaked visage had become my identity to many in the city, a symbol of either hope or doom, depending on one's perspective. Tonight, however, anonymity might serve me better. I left it hanging there, its empty eye sockets staring back at me like a silent judge. Instead, I reached for a simpler cloth mask that would conceal my features without marking me immediately as a physician. I tucked it into my cloak pocket, alongside a small dagger, a precaution I had taken to carrying since the early days of the outbreak, when fear made men unpredictable. The letter found its way into an inner pocket, close to my heart. Whatever truth awaited me at the abandoned chapel, I would face it with the same methodical observation I applied to my patients. Assess, diagnose, remedy, if remedy there could be. I doused the candle with a practiced pinch, plunging my quarters into darkness, relieved only by the faint glow from the hearth. The shadows seemed to whisper as I moved toward the door, my footsteps deliberately quiet against the wooden floor. One more mystery, I murmured, replacing my earlier ritual with a new acknowledgement of the night's uncertain path. With a final glance at my plague doctor's mask, my protection, my prison, I slipped out into the corridor, locking my door behind me. The letter's promise pulled me forward into the night, where truths and dangers awaited in equal measure. I had heard whispers of it for days, a crumbling sanctuary at the city's edge where the sickness supposedly began. My physician's mind dismissed such tales as the frightened murmurings of a desperate populace. Yet, as the plague continued its relentless march through our streets, I found myself drawn to investigate every possibility, no matter how unlikely. The path to the chapel wound through overgrown fields where wildflowers had reclaimed what was once tilled earth. In better times, farmers would have been tending these lands. Now they lay abandoned, a testament to how thoroughly death had emptied our world. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as I trudged forward, my leather boots sinking slightly into the soft ground with each step. My mask, that beaked visage that had become my second face, I carried at my side, granting myself a brief respite from its confines. The chapel appeared on the horizon like a wound in the landscape, a crumbling structure of stone and rotting wood, its bell tower listing dangerously to one side, as though it might topple with the next strong wind. As I approached, I noted how nature had begun its slow reclamation. Ivy crawled up the western wall, pushing between stones with patient persistence. The wooden door hung askew on its hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. I paused at the threshold, suddenly aware of the profound silence. No birds sang here, no insects buzzed. It was as though all living things knew to avoid this place. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open, wincing at the protest of rusted hinges that shattered the stillness like glass. Inside, the chapel was a monument to neglect. Rows of wooden pews, their surfaces thick with dust, stretched toward a simple altar. Above it, a crucifix hung crookedly, the carved Christ figure seeming to gaze down with hollow eyes. What struck me most were the murals, once vibrant depictions of saints and biblical scenes now peeling from the walls in great flakes, their colors faded to ghostly echoes of former glory. The air hung heavy with mildew and decay, a damp chill that penetrated my woolen coat and settled in my bones despite the summer heat outside. Dust motes danced in the few beams of light that managed to penetrate the broken stained glass windows. Those windows, once the pride of this humble chapel, now lay in fragments, their colored shards scattered across the stone floor like the remnants of some forgotten celebration. I moved slowly down the central aisle, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Each step stirred up small clouds of dust that swirled around my feet before settling once more. I ran my fingers along the back of a pew, leaving a clean trail in the gray blanket of time. How long has this place been abandoned? I wondered aloud, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the thick air. And then I heard it, a footstep, not my own, but the unmistakable sound of weight shifting on ancient floorboards. I froze, my heart quickening despite my rational mind insisting I was alone. Since the first death, came a voice from the shadows behind the altar. I whirled around, my hand instinctively reaching for the small knife I kept concealed in my coat, a precaution I'd adopted as the city descended into chaos and desperation. From the darkness emerged a figure, an old man, his face a map of wrinkles and his beard a cascade of white that reached nearly to his waist. He wore simple clothes, threadbare but clean, and leaned heavily on a gnarled walking stick that looked to have been carved from a single piece of wood. "You need not fear me, doctor," he said, his voice carrying the rasp of age, but none of the weakness. "I am merely the keeper of this place and its memories." "How did you know I was a physician?" I asked, noting that I carried no visible signs of my profession, having left my mask and medical bag by the entrance. A smile crept across his weathered face, revealing surprisingly strong teeth for a man of his apparent years. "Your hands, they bear the stains of herbs and tinctures, and there is a certain way physicians carry themselves, always observing, always assessing." He was perceptive, I had to admit. I relaxed my grip on the hidden knife, but remained wary. "This chapel, why do people say the plague began here?" The old man gestured toward a wooden bench near what remained of the altar. "Sit, if you wish. It's a story that deserves proper telling." Against my better judgment, I found myself accepting his invitation. The bench creaked under my weight, sending up another small cloud of dust. "They say the plague began here because in a manner of speaking it did," he began, lowering himself carefully onto a stool that I hadn't noticed before. "Not the sickness itself, perhaps, but the knowledge of it." As he spoke, the fading light through the broken windows cast strange, elongated shadows across the peeling murals. One particular shadow seemed to dance across the image of Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows, a martyr often invoked against the plague. "There was a traveling monk who came here last autumn," the old man continued, his eyes distant with memory. "He brought stories from the east, tales of whole cities emptied of life. No one believed him then. They thought him a madman or a doomsayer." He laughed, a hollow sound. "They drove him away, but his prophecies remained, seeping into these walls like poison." A sudden gust of wind whistled through the broken windows, causing the hanging crucifix to sway slightly. I suppressed a shiver that had nothing to do with the chill. "Superstition," I said firmly, though something in his manner made me uncertain. "The plague is a natural phenomenon, a miasma arising from corrupted air and humors." "Is it?" The old man's eyes, clear and gray as winter ice, fixed on mine. "Then why have your treatments failed? Why do your herbs and bloodlettings and prayers provide no relief?" His question struck uncomfortably close to my daily frustrations. Despite all my knowledge and efforts, I had saved precious few of those touched by the Black Death. "There are some evils science has yet to conquer," I admitted reluctantly. The old man nodded slowly. "And some evils that are not born of nature at all." He rose then, moving with surprising grace for one of his years, and approached one of the peeling murals. With a gentle touch, he brushed away decades of dust to reveal a scene I had not noticed before. Figures in red robes gathered around what appeared to be a well. "Do you know of the doctor in red?" he asked quietly. My blood ran cold. The journal I'd found in the apothecary's shop had warned of such a figure. Before I could respond, bells began to toll in the distance, the city's evening curfew. I would need to hurry if I wished to return before the gates closed. I must go, I said, standing quickly. The old man didn't try to stop me, merely nodding as though he had expected this. Return tomorrow if you wish to hear more, or never return at all. The choice, as always, is yours. As I gathered my things and hurried toward the door, his parting words followed me like a shadow. But remember, Doctor, some truths once heard cannot be unheard, and some knowledge changes a man forever. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson. The city walls loomed in the distance, and I quickened my pace, my mind racing with questions. Who was this old man? How did he know of the doctor in red? And why did his warnings resonate so deeply with the strange events I had witnessed in recent days? As I reached the crest of a small hill, I glanced back at the chapel. For just a moment, I thought I saw a flash of crimson at one of the broken windows, a figure watching my departure. But when I blinked, it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had been merely a trick of the fading light, or something far more sinister. Tomorrow I would return. Tomorrow I would demand answers. For now the city awaited, and with it, more souls crying out for a mercy I feared I could not provide. The evening bells fell silent as I made my way through the narrow alleyways toward the chapel. My steps echoed against the cobblestones, each footfall a hesitant commitment to what lay ahead. I had followed the cryptic instructions left at my doorstep, a red wax seal, a charcoal sketch of the chapel, and a time written in a hand I did not recognize. The plague mask hung heavy from my belt, its vacant eyes catching moonlight as I walked. I hadn't worn it tonight. Whatever awaited me, I wanted to face it with my own eyes unobscured. The chapel stood dark against the night sky, its stained glass windows like black mirrors. No candles burned within, no evening prayer being offered. Strange for a city so desperate for divine intervention. I pulled the iron handle, and the ancient door swung open with surprising ease, as if recently oiled. Hello? My voice was swallowed by the vaulted ceiling, returning no echo. The air inside smelled not of incense, but of something earthier, herbs and minerals I recognized from my own medicinal stores. A single candle flickered to life near the altar, though I saw no hand that lit it. Then another, and another, creating a path down the center aisle. I followed them, my physician's bag clutched tight against my side, more for comfort than utility. The candles led to a small door behind the altar I had never noticed before, partially concealed by heavy tapestries depicting saints ministering to the sick. How fitting. I pushed the tapestry aside and discovered the door was already ajar. Stone stairs spiraled downward, each step worn smooth from centuries of use. The air grew cooler as I descended, the damp stone walls glistening in the dim light of mounted torches. My breath clouded before me, and I pulled my cloak tighter around my shoulders. The stairway opened into a chamber that could not possibly exist within the known foundations of the chapel. The ceiling arched high above, supported by columns carved with symbols I recognized from ancient texts, alchemical notations, astronomical charts, and stranger markings I could not decipher. "You've come." The voice, rich and cultured, emerged from the shadows before the man himself stepped into view. The doctor in red. His crimson robes seemed to absorb the torchlight rather than reflect it, creating an aura of darkness around him despite the chamber's illumination. Unlike my beaked mask, his was a simple black covering that revealed only his eyes, dark and penetrating. "I've seen you watching me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Following me through the streets." "Observing," he corrected, moving toward a large wooden table at the center of the room. Upon it lay manuscripts, vials of colored liquids, and instruments of brass and silver, evaluating whether you might be ready to understand what we offer. As if summoned by my question, other figures emerged from alcoves around the chamber's perimeter, 5 of them, 3 in black robes, 2 in deep purple, all masked. They formed a semicircle behind the doctor in red, but remained silent observers. "The Brotherhood of the Crimson Veil," he said, removing his gloves to reveal hands unmarked by age or labor. "Physicians who have transcended the limitations of conventional medicine." I glanced at the table's contents more carefully now. Some of the manuscripts were written in languages I knew, Latin, Greek, Arabic, but others used scripts I had never encountered. Diagrams showed human anatomy, with curious annotations about energies and flows that belonged more to mysticism than medicine. "You've been fighting a losing battle," the Red Doctor continued, circling the table toward me, "treating symptoms with herbs and bloodletting, while the true nature of the plague eludes you. You've saved few, if any." The truth of his words stung more than I cared to admit. For all my knowledge, for all my tireless efforts, death claimed most who fell ill. "And you claim to have answers?" I asked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. He gestured to one of the black-robed figures, who stepped forward with a small wooden box. When opened, it revealed a vial containing a liquid that seemed to shift between deep crimson and black depending on how the light struck it. "We have more than answers," the doctor in red said. "We have mastery over disease, over life and death themselves." "That's not possible," I whispered, though the conviction in my voice faltered. "The barrier between life and death is more permeable than most believe," he replied, lifting the vial from its velvet bed. "The plague is merely one manifestation of the imbalance between realms, an imbalance we have learned to control." My scientific mind rebelled against such talk, yet I could not deny the evidence of my senses. The impossible chamber beneath a chapel I had visited dozens of times, the strange symbols that seemed to shimmer with inner light, the unnatural stillness of the masked figures who had not drawn breath since entering the room. "Join us," he said, extending the vial toward me. "Your knowledge, your compassion for the suffering, these are valuable, but limited. With what we offer, you could truly save this city, perhaps even understand why certain souls are marked for death, while others are spared." I thought of the dying merchant, the noble household in mourning, the mass graves filling faster than they could be dug. Had all my years of study and practice been little more than flailing against an incomprehensible force? "And the price?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. The doctor in red's eyes crinkled with what might have been a smile beneath his mask. "Perception. You perceive it as your soul because that is the language you understand. We simply ask for your singular devotion to knowledge beyond conventional boundaries, to powers that the Church would name blasphemous, but which predate their narrow understanding." He gestured around the chamber. "This society has persisted through plagues, wars, and inquisitions. We have walked with death and returned to share its wisdom. The choice is yours. Continue your futile work with poultices and prayers, or embrace a higher understanding." I stared at the vial, its contents seeming to pulse with its own heartbeat. The temptation was profound. To know, to truly heal, to master the force that had claimed so many under my care. "I need time," I said at last, stepping back from the table. The doctor in red nodded, as if he had expected this answer. "Dawn approaches. Return to your quarters and consider what we've shown you. But know that times of plague allow for unusual possibilities. The veil between worlds thins. This opportunity may not come again." He pressed something cold and metallic into my palm, a key with the same red seal as the letter. "For when you decide," he said. "We will be watching." I ascended the spiral staircase with my mind in turmoil, the key heavy in my pocket. As I emerged into the chapel, The first gray light of dawn filtered through the stained glass, casting colored shadows across the empty pews. Outside, the morning mist clung to the streets as I made my way home, the city beginning to stir. A cart rolled past, collecting the night's dead. The driver nodded to me, one professional to another in the business of mortality. I would need to decide soon. The doctor in red and his brotherhood offered power beyond imagining, but at what true cost? And could I live with myself if I refused, knowing I might have saved countless lives? The day stretched before me, full of the sick and dying awaiting my arrival, but for the first time, I wondered if my familiar bag of remedies was nothing more than a child's playthings against the tide of death sweeping the city. The laboratory's existence was a whisper among physicians who dared tread between science and superstition. As I followed Dr. Martell down the winding stone steps beneath the chapel, the air grew thick, not with the scent of illness that had become my constant companion, but with something sharper, more chemical. I clutched my physician's bag tighter, my weathered knuckles whitening against the worn leather. What you are about to witness, Dr. Thorne, remains between us and God, Martell murmured, his voice barely audible above the dripping of water from the stone ceiling. The society has worked in secrecy since the plague first appeared 4 winters ago. I nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at me. The journey through the catacombs beneath the city had been long past forgotten crypts and ancient waterways. The plague had taken so many lives. If their research offered hope, how could I refuse to look? The brass key Martell produced was ornate, fashioned in the shape of a serpent devouring its own tail. The lock yielded, with a weighted click that seemed to echo through my bones. The heavy oak door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a glow of amber light. "Welcome," he said, "to the Chamber of Mysteries." The laboratory sprawled before me, a cathedral to science, both familiar and foreign. Candles and oil lamps illuminated a space larger than I had imagined possible beneath the city streets. Tables of polished wood lined the walls, their surfaces crowded with instruments. Some I recognized, others beyond my comprehension. Glass vessels of every shape captured the light, containing liquids in shades nature never intended. "We have been expecting you," came a voice from the shadows. A woman stepped forward, her dark hair streaked with silver, her eyes sharp as a surgeon's blade. I recognized her instantly. Lady Helena Blackwood, rumored to have died of the plague 3 months prior. "You seem troubled, Dr. Thorne," she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Did you truly believe death would prevent me from continuing my work?" I found my voice at last. "The city mourned you, your family. My family understands sacrifice," she interrupted. "Now shall I show you what we've discovered?" My feet moved of their own accord across the stone floor, worn smooth by countless footsteps before mine. The laboratory hummed with activity. 3 other figures in long robes moved between workstations, recording observations in leather-bound journals. At the center of the room stood a large glass container, tall enough for a man to stand within. Inside, suspended in clear liquid, floated what appeared to be. I stepped closer, my breath catching, a human heart still beating, though no body surrounded it. "Impossible," I whispered. "The boundaries between life and death are not as fixed as medicine has taught us," Lady Helena said, placing her hand against the glass. The heart seemed to pulse stronger at her touch. "We have found ways to preserve life, to hold it in suspension." Along the far wall, shelves held dozens of jars, each containing specimens that defied description, organs maintained in various states of transformation, creatures that seemed neither fully animal nor human. Some moved within their glass prisons, pressing against their confines with appendages that should not exist. "Is this medicine?" I asked, my throat dry. Dr. Martell chuckled. "It is progress. The plague is no natural affliction, Dr. Thorne. It was created by men who sought to thin the populace, to reshape society according to their vision. We merely seek to understand it, to master it before they do. I moved slowly through the laboratory, my senses overwhelmed. The air tasted metallic on my tongue. Beneath the chemical scents lay something earthy and profound. The smell of life and decay intermingled. A soft humming emanated from a contraption in the corner, where tubes and wires connected to a mass that pulsed with an unsettling rhythm. "This one," Lady Helena said, guiding me toward a table where a rat lay strapped to a wooden board, "survived direct exposure to the miasma that kills within hours. We've modified its humors, balanced them in ways traditional medicine cannot comprehend." The creature's eyes were alert, following my movements, its breathing steady. Despite the blackened lesions visible on its skin, it showed no signs of suffering. "And you believe this can be applied to humans?" I asked, unable to look away from the creature's too intelligent gaze. "It already has been," Dr. Martell said quietly. He directed my attention to a doorway draped with heavy velvet. Beyond it lay a smaller chamber where 5 beds were arranged in a circle. Each held a patient, motionless, eyes closed, skin bearing the telltale marks of advanced plague. Yet their chests rose and fell with steady breaths. "They were gone," Lady Helena explained. "Their souls had departed. We brought them back, kept the vessels intact." I approached the nearest bed, where a young woman lay. Her skin was cool to my touch. The blackened buboes on her neck dried and hardened, yet a pulse throbbed beneath my fingertips, impossibly strong. "She doesn't wake," I observed. "The body lives. The mind," Dr. Martell shrugged. "Perhaps it wanders elsewhere." We continued to refine the process. I moved between the beds, examining each patient with growing unease. They were alive yet not living, preserved in a state between existence and void. My fingers trembled as I checked pulses, peered into unseen eyes, listened to hearts that should have stilled weeks ago. "And what of the doctor in red?" I asked, recalling the warnings, the figure that had haunted my steps for days. "Is he part of your society?" A silence fell over the laboratory. The humming of machinery seemed to grow louder in the absence of voices. "The doctor in red opposes our work," Lady Helena finally said. "He believes some knowledge should remain forbidden, that our experiments transgress against nature itself." "And does he not have a point?" I asked, gesturing to the specimens, the half-living patients. Dr. Martell's expression hardened. "Would you rather watch thousands more die, Dr. Thorne? Would you prefer to continue applying leeches and burning herbs while the grave diggers work through the night? We offer an alternative." I stood in the center of the laboratory, surrounded by wonders and horrors alike. The candlelight flickered across glass and metal, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. "I must consider what I've seen," I said at last. "This is beyond what I expected." Lady Helena stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Tomorrow night, we attempt the final procedure, a true resurrection, not merely preservation. We would value your expertise, Dr. Thorne, and if I decline, then we trust in your discretion," she replied, though her eyes suggested otherwise. "But consider, would you rather be a witness to history, or merely its subject?" As I ascended the stone steps back toward the world of the living, the weight of their invitation pressed upon me like a physical burden. The laboratory's secrets clung to my clothing, my skin, my conscience. Tomorrow I would have to decide whether to return and witness their ultimate experiment, or to seek out the doctor in red and learn what he knew of this society and their work beneath the city. The night was old when I emerged, stars fading as dawn approached. I would have precious little time to rest before my duties called me back to the streets, to the mundane horror of the plague's continued march through the city. Yet I knew sleep would elude me, my mind filled with beating hearts in glass jars and patients who breathed but did not wake. The laboratory's existence was a whisper among physicians who dared tread between science and superstition. As I followed Dr. Martell down the winding stone steps beneath the chapel, the air grew thick, not with the scent of illness, that had become my constant companion, but with something sharper, more chemical. I clutched my physician's bag tighter, my weathered knuckles whitening against the worn leather. "What you are about to witness, Dr. Thorne, remains between us and God," Martel murmured, his voice barely audible above the dripping of water from the stone ceiling. "The Society has worked in secrecy since the plague first appeared 4 winters ago." I nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at me. The journey through the catacombs beneath the city had been long past forgotten crypts and ancient waterways. The plague had taken so many lives. If their research offered hope, how could I refuse to look? The brass key Martel produced was ornate, fashioned in the shape of a serpent devouring its own tail. The lock yielded, with a weighted click that seemed to echo through my bones. The heavy oak door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a glow of amber light. "Welcome," he said, "to the Chamber of Mysteries." The laboratory sprawled before me, a cathedral to science, both familiar and foreign. Candles and oil lamps illuminated a space larger than I had imagined possible beneath the city streets. Tables of polished wood lined the walls, their surfaces crowded with instruments. Some I recognized, others beyond my comprehension. Glass vessels of every shape captured the light, containing liquids in shades nature never intended. "We have been expecting you," came a voice from the shadows. A woman stepped forward, her dark hair streaked with silver, her eyes sharp as a surgeon's blade. I recognized her instantly. Lady Helena Blackwood, rumored to have died of the plague 3 months prior. "You seem troubled, Dr. Thorne," she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Did you truly believe death would prevent me from continuing my work?" I found my voice at last. "The city mourned you. Your family, my family understands sacrifice," she interrupted. "Now shall I show you what we've discovered?" My feet moved of their own accord across the stone floor, worn smooth by countless footsteps before mine. The laboratory hummed with activity. 3 other figures in long robes moved between workstations, recording observations in leather-bound journals. At the center of the room stood a large glass container, tall enough for a man to stand within. Inside, suspended in clear liquid, floated what appeared to be. I stepped closer, my breath catching, a human heart still beating, though no body surrounded it. "Impossible," I whispered. "The boundaries between life and death are not as fixed as medicine has taught us," Lady Helena said, placing her hand against the glass. The heart seemed to pulse stronger at her touch. "We have found ways to preserve life, to hold it in suspension." Along the far wall, shelves held dozens of jars, each containing specimens that defied description, organs maintained in various states of transformation, creatures that seemed neither fully animal nor human. Some moved within their glass prisons, pressing against their confines with appendages that should not exist. "Is this medicine?" I asked, my throat dry. Dr. Martel chuckled. "It is progress. The plague is no natural affliction, Dr. Thorne. It was created by men who sought to thin the populace, to reshape society according to their vision. We merely seek to understand it, to master it before they do." I moved slowly through the laboratory, my senses overwhelmed. The air tasted metallic on my tongue. Beneath the chemical scents lay something earthy and profound, the smell of life and decay intermingled. A soft humming emanated from a contraption in the corner, where tubes and wires connected to a mass that pulsed with an unsettling rhythm. "This one," Lady Helena said, guiding me toward a table where a rat lay strapped to a wooden board, "survived direct exposure to the miasma that kills within hours. We've modified its humors, balanced them in ways traditional medicine cannot comprehend." The creature's eyes were alert, following my movements, its breathing steady. Despite the blackened lesions visible on its skin, it showed no signs of suffering. "And you believe this can be applied to humans?" I asked, unable to look away from the creature's too intelligent gaze. "It already has been," Dr. Martel said quietly. He directed my attention to a doorway draped with heavy velvet. Beyond it lay a smaller chamber where 5 beds were arranged in a circle. Each held a patient, motionless, eyes closed, skin bearing the telltale marks of advanced plague. Yet their chests rose and fell with steady breaths. "They were gone," Lady Helena explained. "Their souls had departed. We brought them back, kept the vessels intact." I approached the nearest bed, where a young woman lay. Her skin was cool to my touch. The blackened buboes on her neck dried and hardened, yet a pulse throbbed beneath my fingertips, impossibly strong. "She doesn't wake," I observed. "The body lives. The mind," Dr. Martel shrugged. "Perhaps it wanders elsewhere." We continued to refine the process. I moved between the beds, examining each patient with growing unease. They were alive yet not living, preserved in a state between existence and void. My fingers trembled as I checked pulses, peered into unseeing eyes, listened to hearts that should have stilled weeks ago. "And what of the doctor in red?" I asked, recalling the warnings, the figure that had haunted my steps for days. "Is he part of your society?" A silence fell over the laboratory. The humming of machinery seemed to grow louder in the absence of voices. "The doctor in red opposes our work," Lady Helena finally said. "He believes some knowledge should remain forbidden, that our experiments transgress against nature itself." "And does he not have a point?" I asked, gesturing to the specimens, the half-living patients. Dr. Martel's expression hardened. "Would you rather watch thousands more die, Dr. Thorne? Would you prefer to continue applying leeches and burning herbs while the grave diggers work through the night? We offer an alternative." I stood in the center of the laboratory, surrounded by wonders and horrors alike. The candlelight flickered across glass and metal, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. "I must consider what I've seen," I said at last. "This is beyond what I expected." Lady Helena stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Tomorrow night, we attempt the final procedure, a true resurrection, not merely preservation. We would value your expertise, Dr. Thorne, and if I decline, then we trust in your discretion," she replied, though her eyes suggested otherwise. "But consider, would you rather be a witness to history, or merely its subject?" As I ascended the stone steps back toward the world of the living, the weight of their invitation pressed upon me like a physical burden. The laboratory's secrets clung to my clothing, my skin, my conscience. Tomorrow I would have to decide whether to return and witness their ultimate experiment, or to seek out the doctor in red and learn what he knew of this society and their work beneath the city. The night was old when I emerged, stars fading as dawn approached. I would have precious little time to rest before my duties called me back to the streets, to the mundane horror of the plague's continued march through the city. Yet I knew sleep would elude me, my mind filled with beating hearts in glass jars and patients who breathed but did not wake. The chapel stood silent as I approached, its ancient doors slightly ajar, allowing the first tentative fingers of dawn to reach inside. I paused, my leather boots worn from weeks of traversing the city's cobbled streets, and removed my beaked mask. The weight of it had left impressions upon my skin, like the burden of knowledge had marked my soul. Behind me lay a path of death, discovery, and betrayal. Before me stood the chapel, no longer merely a house of God, but the threshold between two futures. I traced the weathered stone archway with my gloved fingertips, feeling the centuries of prayers that had seeped into its fabric. "So you have come," a voice echoed from within. The doctor in red emerged from the shadows, his crimson robes catching the meager light like spilled blood. "I wondered if you would find the courage." I stepped forward, my medical bag clutched in one hand, the journal of evidence in the other. The air smelled of frankincense, and something sharper, the unmistakable tang of chemicals that had become as familiar to me as my own scent. "I know what you've done," I said, my voice steady, despite the exhaustion that pulled at every fiber of my being. The society has manufactured this plague to control the city, to determine who lives and who dies. The doctor in red laughed, a sound like distant bells. Manufactured? No. Guided, perhaps. The plague is nature's creation. We merely direct its course. Inside the chapel, candles flickered in strange patterns. I noticed how the pews had been pushed aside, creating space for what appeared to be an alchemical laboratory. Glass vials caught the dawn light, their contents shimmering with possibilities. The cure, I realized, not just a treatment, but a true remedy for the sickness that had claimed thousands. You seek to play God, I whispered, moving closer to the altar, where a single vial glowed with amber luminescence. We seek to advance humanity beyond its limitations, he corrected, removing his own mask to reveal a face marked by age yet untouched by disease. For centuries, we have guided humanity through its darkest hours. The plague is but one instrument in a grand composition. I set my bag down, aware of the weight of the decision before me. From the shadows emerged figures I recognized. The nobleman whose family had vanished, the apothecary I'd thought missing, the painter who had insisted on capturing my likeness. All wore the same knowing expression. All stood watching me with patient eyes. Join us, the doctor in red said, lifting the amber vial. Take the cure. Become part of a lineage that stretches back to Alexandria, to Babylon. We are the shepherds who guide humanity through its darkest nights. I opened the journal, its pages filled with my desperate scribbles, connecting threads of evidence across weeks of investigation. And what of those you sacrifice? The poor who die while the wealthy somehow survive. The children who, progress requires sacrifice, he interrupted, his voice softening. You have seen how the city's governors failed to act, how the church offers prayers instead of solutions. We act where others merely theorize. The morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the chapel floor. Outside, I could hear the city awakening, the distant toll of bells, the creak of cartwheels, the murmur of survivors beginning another day in a diminished world. I thought of Isabella, the merchant's daughter who had died in my arms, her small fingers clutching my sleeve as she begged for relief I couldn't provide. I thought of the mass graves, the lime-covered bodies, the prayers that went unanswered. The plague will end, the doctor said, moving closer, by natural course or by our intervention. But another will come, as they always do. Be with us when it does. Help us shape a better future from catastrophe. My fingers traced the edge of the journal. Within its pages lay enough evidence to expose their machinations to the world. The experiments conducted in secret chambers, the selective distribution of treatments, the manipulation of city officials. Why me? I asked, genuinely curious. The doctor smiled. Because you question, because you seek understanding beyond dogma, because when faced with the impossible, you look for answers rather than miracles. He extended the vial toward me. This is not merely the cure for plague, it preserves life beyond normal boundaries. Those who take it rarely succumb to any disease. I looked at the assembled figures with new understanding. How old are you? All of you. The question hung in the air, unanswered yet acknowledged by their knowing smiles. I stepped toward the altar, feeling the weight of choice pressing down upon me. The journal in my hand, truth, exposure, justice for the dead. The vial before me, power, knowledge, the ability to truly heal rather than merely comfort the dying. Outside, a bird began to sing, a simple, clear melody that cut through the chapel's silence. I closed my eyes, listening to its voice, life persisting despite everything. I thought of all I had witnessed these past weeks, the courage of the dying, the greed of the powerful, the persistence of hope in lightless places. Dawn approaches, The doctor in red said softly. With it comes your decision. Expose us and risk being dismissed as a madman if you survive long enough to speak, or join us and help guide humanity through its next great trial. I opened my eyes, looking at the faces surrounding me. Were they villains or visionaries, monsters or mankind's secret guardians? The line between healer and harm had never seemed so thin. The vial glowed in the strengthening light, its contents shifting like liquid gold. The journal weighed heavy in my hand, its pages filled with damning evidence gathered at tremendous risk. Choose, he whispered. The world waits for someone to determine its course. I took a deep breath, the scent of candle wax and ancient stone filling my lungs. Whatever choice I made now would echo through my remaining days, however many or few they might be. To expose the truth and risk everything, or to embrace a power that might truly end suffering, even as it corrupted those who wielded it. My hand moved forward, my decision crystallizing with each heartbeat. The chapel seemed to hold its breath as dawn fully breached the horizon, casting the stained glass windows into brilliant fractured light. I knew what I must do. The final steps of my journey home felt heavier than all the miles I had walked before. Twilight had long since surrendered to night, and the moon hung full and indifferent above the city's suffering. My feet knew the way, even as my mind wandered through the labyrinth of the day's revelations. The leather of my plague mask creaked as I turned my head to observe the empty street behind me. No followers tonight. Not the doctor in red, nor his accomplices. Perhaps they believed their secret safe now. Perhaps they were simply watching from somewhere I could not see. I had left the journal where I knew it would be found by the right hands, not the magistrate's men who were in the pockets of the merchant guilds, but in the care of Father Thomas, whose conscience had not yet been purchased. The document detailed everything: the contaminated grain, the wealthy men who profited from the artificially heightened prices, the deliberate infection of the lower quarters to drive the poor from their homes. For some, the plague was not a scourge, but an opportunity, its victims mere figures in a ledger. My key turned in the lock of my modest lodgings, and I stepped inside, greeted by darkness and the faint, familiar scent of dried rosemary and wormwood that hung from my ceiling. I struck flint to steel, coaxing a reluctant flame to birth in the tinder. The candle caught, and shadows leapt across the walls like memories trying to escape. Enough light to see by. I murmured to no one, my voice strange in my ears after a day of speaking through the mask's beak. My chambers were Spartan, but sufficient. A single bed pushed against the wall, a desk cluttered with the tools of my trade: scissors, tweezers, vials of vinegar and dried herbs, books of medicine stacked precariously beside theological texts, the tools of science and faith, neither offering complete answers to the questions that haunted me. I removed my wide-brimmed hat first, placing it on its hook by the door. Then came the gloves, stiff with the day's grime. I flexed my fingers, feeling the blood flow return to my hands. The leather straps of my mask came next, loosened one by one. The ritual of undressing was always slow, deliberate, a transition between worlds. As the mask came away, cool air touched my damp skin, and I breathed deeply for what felt like the first time in hours. The mask's interior smelled of lavender, mint, and clove, the herbs I packed into the beak to ward off miasma. I placed it carefully on its stand, the beaked silhouette casting an avian shadow across my desk. My heavy waxed coat followed, its weight lifting from my shoulders like a penance complete. Beneath, my clothes were soaked with sweat despite the autumn chill. I would need to launder them tomorrow, boiling away any contagion that might cling to the fibers. Another day survived, I said softly, a habit born of too many hours alone, though God knows how many did not. I poured water from a pitcher into a basin, watching it ripple in the candlelight. The simplicity of clean water, how precious it seemed now, in a city where some wells had been declared forbidden. I washed my face and hands thoroughly, rinsing away the day. The water turned gray with soot and sweat. My stomach growled, reminding me I had forgotten to eat again. I broke off a piece of hard bread and chewed it slowly, tasting nothing. Food had become merely fuel, a necessity rather than a pleasure. I washed it down with watered wine, sour but clean. Sitting at my desk, I opened my journal, the leather binding worn smooth by years of handling. I dipped my quill and began to write, recording the day's events while they remained clear in my mind. The noble house, with its emptied rooms, the merchant's desperate confessions, the apothecary's warnings, the document hidden in the church's crypt, bearing the seal of men who claimed to be the city's saviors. My handwriting grew less steady as fatigue crept into my bones. I had walked miles today, from the grand houses on the hill to the squalid tenements by the river. I had seen the plague in all its forms, the swellings, the fever, the black spots that gave the disease its name. I had offered what comfort I could, knowing it was rarely enough. The candlelight flickered, casting my shadow long against the wall. In that moment, I saw not just my silhouette, but the shape of all I had become in these plague months. A figure caught between science and superstition, between healing and merely witnessing, between truth and survival. Outside, the bell tolled the midnight hour. One day ending, another beginning, though the distinction meant little in a city where time seemed suspended in suffering. Would tomorrow bring change? Would Father Thomas read the journal and act upon its revelations? Or would the doctor in red find him first? I closed the journal and sealed it with wax. Whatever tomorrow brought, I had done what I could. I had sworn an oath to heal, not to look away. Some might call it foolishness in these dark times, when self-preservation seemed the only rational choice. Perhaps they were right. The candle guttered as I prepared for bed, my limbs heavy with exhaustion. I did not bother with prayers tonight. God had heard enough from me. Accusations, bargains, and finally, a weary acceptance that some battles must be fought by men alone. As I lay down, I thought of the faces I had seen today. The mother who wept as I confirmed what she already knew about her child. The old man who thanked me even as the plague's marks spread across his skin. The young apprentice who might yet survive, his fever breaking under my care. My eyelids grew heavy, the candle's flame dancing behind them as they closed. In the space between wakefulness and sleep, I wondered if I would dream tonight, or if exhaustion would grant me the mercy of oblivion. The plague would still be here tomorrow. The doctor in red and his conspirators would still be weaving their schemes. The poor would still be dying while the rich sealed themselves behind high walls, and I would don my mask once more, step into the streets, and continue the work that fate or folly had assigned to me. But for now, there was only the gentle press of the mattress beneath me, the weight of the blanket above, and the distant sounds of a city that, despite everything, continued to live. My breathing slowed, deepened. In this moment, this small sanctuary of darkness and rest, I allowed myself to believe that tomorrow might be different, that the truth I had uncovered might matter, that healing was still possible for the city, for its people, perhaps even for me. Sleep came like a gentle tide, washing away the day's horrors, if only until dawn.